The morning Elara Vale became Queen of Thornkeep, the sky above the fortress bled the color of old roses, pale pink bruised through with gray, as if the heavens themselves couldn't decide whether to celebrate or mourn. She was 22 years old. She remembered standing at the threshold of the great stone hall with a crown of silver woven into her dark hair, holding a bouquet of white hawthorn blooms that trembled slightly in her grip. Not from cold, from nerves. From the specific hollow terror of walking toward a man she had met exactly twice. Once across a treaty table when she was 16, and once 3 days ago when the marriage contracts were signed. Alpha King Ronan Thorn had not smiled at her either time. He stood at the altar like something carved from the mountain itself, broad-shouldered and immovable, his dark eyes fixed somewhere past her left ear, his jaw set in a line so rigid it might have been cast in iron. He was handsome in the way that storms are handsome, impressive, cold, and likely to destroy things. He doesn't want this, Elara had thought, clutching her hawthorn tighter. He doesn't want me. But she walked forward anyway because her father had asked it of her, because 2 territories had been bleeding each other dry for 11 years, and someone had to be the peace offering, because Elara Vale had always been the kind of woman who walked forward even when every instinct screamed retreat. The vows were exchanged in a language older than both their bloodlines. Ronan Thorn pressed his lips to her hand, not her mouth, just her hand, and the assembled court erupted in applause. That night, her new husband showed her to her chambers, wished her a courteous good evening, and disappeared behind a door that locked from the inside. She sat on the edge of a bed large enough to sleep 6 people, in a room decorated with tapestries she hadn't chosen and flowers she hadn't requested, and she told herself that this was fine, that this was politics, that she had not expected warmth. She told herself that for 7 years. The thing about being Queen of Thornkeep was that the role itself was not without its satisfactions. Elara was good at it. Better, she suspected, than most people had anticipated when Ronan's council first reviewed her credentials. A young woman from the Vale territories, educated but not battle-trained, chosen for her bloodline's diplomatic history rather than any personal strength. She remembered Lord Aldrich Vane, the king's senior advisor, looking at her over the rim of his spectacles with an expression that could only be described as politely underwhelmed. The Queen will of course defer to the Council on matters of territorial law, he had said at their first formal meeting, in a tone that suggested this was not a suggestion. Elara had smiled pleasantly. Of course, my lord, I'll begin by reviewing the water rights dispute in the eastern boroughs. I understand it's been unresolved for 3 years? Aldrich had blinked. That matter is rather complex. I read the case files last night, all 14 volumes. She tilted her head. Shall we begin? She had resolved the Eastern water dispute in 6 weeks, the border tax negotiations in 4 months. When a fever swept through the lower districts the following winter, it was Elara who organized the medical response. Elara who rode out personally to oversee the distribution of supplies. Elara whose face the people of Thornkeep learned to associate with competence and calm. Her husband noticed. She could tell by the slight shift in how he watched her during council meetings, the way his eyes would follow her when she spoke, something flickering briefly behind those dark irises before his expression closed again, like a door swinging shut. He never said anything directly, never complimented her work or acknowledged her contributions in private. Occasionally in council, he would end a debate by stating, "The Queen's position is correct," and move on, as if that were sufficient. As if 4 words from the Alpha King were a feast she should be grateful for. She learned to be grateful for them anyway. She learned to read him in small increments, the way you read a sky for weather, looking for the particular stillness that meant he was listening carefully, the almost imperceptible tension in his hands when something troubled him, the rare softening around his eyes when a child approached him in a crowd and reached for his fingers without fear. He was not cruel. That was the thing she came back to, in the quiet hours of the night when the loneliness pressed heaviest against her chest. Ronan Thorn was not cruel. He was absent, present in body and vanished in every way that mattered. A king who ruled with formidable competence and retreated behind walls so thick and high that even his own court couldn't tell what lay beyond them. She did not know what had built those walls. She spent 7 years wondering. The whispers started in the second year of their marriage. The queen is barren. She heard it first from a maid who didn't know she was standing on the other side of a tapestry in the corridor. Two young women with their heads bent together, voices low but not low enough. "Poor thing," one of them said. 7 months married and not even a hint of a child. My cousin's husband would have taken another woman to his bed by now. Elara had stood very still on the other side of that tapestry for a long moment. Then she straightened her shoulders, walked around the corner, and asked the maids if they had completed their morning duties. They scattered like startled birds. She walked to her sitting room, closed the door, sat down at her writing desk, and stared at the blank page of her correspondence journal for 20 minutes without writing a single word. Barren. The word was a specific kind of wound, because she didn't know if it was true. Couldn't know. Had never been given the opportunity to find out. Her husband came to her chambers occasionally, formal visits, seated across from her in the chairs by the fireplace, conversation careful and bounded as a formal negotiation. He never stayed. He never touched her with anything more than the courteous press of his lips against her hand or on state occasions her cheek. Every month, following the protocol established by the court physician, she was expected to attend the king's private chambers to ensure continuity of the royal line. A delicate euphemism for something that in practice meant she knocked on Ronan's door, was admitted by a stone-faced attendant, sat in the anteroom for 20 minutes, and then was escorted back to her own quarters. On the 3 occasions when she had been admitted directly to his bedroom, he had been asleep, or appeared to be asleep. She could never quite tell. He lay motionless as a mountain, breathing slow and even, and she sat beside the bed for the allotted time, feeling like an absolute fool and trying not to look at the sharp lines of his face in the firelight and think about how much she wanted him to simply look at her, not across a council table, not past her shoulder during formal ceremonies, but at her, directly and deliberately, the way people look at things they have chosen. She would leave. He would not stir. She told no one about any of this. "Your Majesty, you look tired." The woman who said this was Mira Dawn, Elara's chief lady-in-waiting and the closest thing she had to a friend inside the fortress walls. Mira was blunt in the way that only truly loyal people can afford to be. She said things no one else dared say, and she said them with such matter-of-fact affection that it was impossible to take offense. "I am tired," Elara said. It was an autumn morning in the 5th year of her marriage, and she was sitting at her vanity while Mira arranged her hair for the day's council session. "I didn't sleep well." "You never sleep well." Mira's hands were deft and gentle, pinning sections of dark hair with practiced efficiency. "Your Majesty, if I may—" "You always may." There are physicians in the Southern Territories, specialists, women who have helped queens in similar situations conceive. "Mira, I'm only saying it isn't a question of conceiving," Elara said it quietly, without inflection, watching her own face in the mirror. "It isn't my difficulty." A silence fell. Mira's hands stilled in her hair. "Oh," Mira said after a moment. "Yes." Another silence. Elara watched the reflection of Mira's face cycle through several expressions: understanding, anger on her behalf, carefully controlled sympathy, before settling into something calm and decided. "Then the court is wrong," Mira said simply, "about you." "The court is almost always wrong about me." Elara attempted a smile. "I've grown accustomed to it. It isn't fair." "Very little is." She picked up her earrings from the vanity. Silver drops, the queen's sigil. "But I am the queen. And the queen does not sit in her room feeling sorry for herself. The queen goes to council and fights the Eastern lords over the grain tax again." Mira met her eyes in the mirror. "You are the strongest person in this fortress," she said. "I hope you know that." Elara put on her earrings. "I know that when I finished with the Eastern lords, they'll know it too." She swept out of the room with her chin up and her back straight, and the particular serene expression she had spent 5 years perfecting. The one that said, "I am exactly where I chose to be and nothing touches me." And she held it all the way down the corridor, around the corner, and into the small alcove beside the great hall, where she stopped for exactly 30 seconds and breathed, just breathed. Then she walked into council. It was in the 6th year that she allowed herself to want something for the first time, not the king. She had put that wanting away carefully, folded it like a letter she would never send, and stored it somewhere small and dark. What she allowed herself to want, cautiously and privately, was simpler than that. A child. The thought crept up on her slowly, the way certain longings do, not arriving in a rush but building by increments until one day you realize it has been there all along, grown so large it fills every quiet room in your chest. She watched children in the market square when she rode through the lower city, watched them with a kind of aching attention she couldn't entirely suppress, the small ones clinging to their mother's skirts, the older ones running in shrieking packs through the cobblestone streets, a boy of perhaps 4 years old who stopped in the middle of the square one autumn afternoon and looked directly up at her on her horse with enormous solemn eyes before his father scooped him up, laughing. She thought, I would be good at it, not from arrogance, but from self-knowledge. She was patient and perceptive and not easily rattled. She knew how to listen. She had always been better at nurturing than she was at most things. The territory, the people, the careful tending of relationships that could either flourish or wither, depending on the attention given them. She would be good at being a mother. She believed that with a quiet certainty that had nothing to do with pride. But there was no child. There was only the court's whispered verdict, barren, poor thing, 7 years and nothing, and her husband's locked door, and the particular specific grief of wanting something you cannot name to anyone because naming it means acknowledging how fully it has been denied. She buried it again, deeper this time. She went back to work. Shum. On the night of the 7th anniversary of her marriage, Elara did something she had not done in years. She walked to Ronan's chambers not at the scheduled time, not when summoned, not as a matter of protocol, but because it was late and the anniversary sat heavy on her, and she was tired, exhausted in the deep-bone way that sleep doesn't fix, and she needed to say something to him even if she didn't know what it was yet. The guard outside his door, a man called Breck, who had been stationed there long enough to know her face without question, looked at her with the careful neutrality of a man who has been trained to reveal nothing. "Your Majesty," he said, "is the king awake?" A pause. "I believe so, Your Majesty." "Tell him I'd like a word, if it pleases him." She waited in the corridor. The stone was cold under her feet. She had come in her nightrobe without slippers, and the chill crept up through her soles. The wall torches threw long shadows across the floor. Somewhere in the eastern wing, a door creaked. Breck returned. "His Majesty will see you." The antechamber was dark except for the fire, which had burned down to a bed of orange coals that threw more shadow than light. Ronan was standing at the window when she entered, his back to her, wearing a loose shirt and dark trousers. The first time she had ever seen him outside of full dress. His feet were also bare. That small detail struck her oddly, as if bare feet were a kind of vulnerability she hadn't been prepared for. "Elara," he said, without turning. His voice was low, rougher than usual, as if she had woken him after all. "I'm sorry to come unannounced," she said. "I won't take long." "You're never announced." He did turn then, and in the dim firelight she could see the lines of his face more clearly than she usually allowed herself to look. The tiredness around his eyes, the tension still held in his jaw even now, at the end of the day when there was no court to perform for. "What is it?" She had rehearsed this. She had thought walking down the corridor that she would say something measured and diplomatic, something about communication, about what they owed each other, about the future of the kingdom. She had a whole speech assembled. What came out instead was, "Do you find me so completely without appeal?" The silence that followed was absolute. Ronan stared at her. Something moved behind his eyes, something she couldn't name, something that flickered and went still with an almost visible effort of will. "That is not—" He stopped. 7 years, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of how steady it was. 7 years I have been your queen. I have ruled well. I have been loyal. I have asked nothing of you but the one thing that would end the court's cruel speculation about my inability to set—" She stopped herself, steadied. "I have never asked you why. I have waited for you to come to me, and you never have. And I find myself tonight on the 7th anniversary of a marriage that has never been a marriage, needing to simply ask, "Is it something specific about me, or simply that you want no woman in that way?" It was the bravest thing she had ever said. Ronan's jaw tightened. He looked away from her, toward the fire, toward the window, toward some middle distance that contained whatever it was he couldn't bring himself to face directly. When he spoke, his voice was flat in the particular way that meant something large was being kept very carefully controlled. "Go back to your chambers, Elara." "No." He looked at her, sharp, surprised. "No," she repeated, quieter. "I'm not going anywhere until you give me an honest answer. After 7 years, I think I've earned at least that." Another long silence. The fire crackled softly. Somewhere outside the castle walls, the night wind pushed against the stones. "It is not," Ronan said finally, each word measured and deliberate, as if he were lifting something heavy. "A question of appeal." She waited. "It is not a question of anything you have done or failed to do." His voice dropped lower. "Or of anything you are." "Then what? I cannot explain it tonight." He looked at her again, and this time the look was direct in a way she was not prepared for, raw and unguarded for just a fraction of a second before the walls came back up. "I am asking you to trust me." "I have trusted you for 7 years," she said quietly. "I have trusted you with my reputation and my dignity and my silence. I'd like to know what I was trusting you with." He didn't answer. She waited until it was clear he wasn't going to. "Good night, Ronan," she said, and left the way she had come, walking carefully and unhurriedly back through the dark corridor to her own rooms, where she sat in the chair by her own dying fire and stared at nothing for a very long time. He had not denied finding her appealing. She didn't know what to do with that. The seasons turned. The kingdom ran. Elara governed and adjudicated and rode the borders, and sat in council and smiled at state functions and wore her crown with the particular careful grace she had developed for carrying heavy things. She learned his rhythms the way you learn the rhythms of weather in a place you've lived long enough. The way his shoulders dropped by a degree in council when a complex problem was finally resolving. The way he looked out the east window on gray mornings. The way he could hold a room silent through sheer stillness, not threatening exactly, but so completely present and unyielding that argument simply dissolved in the face of it. She did not stop wanting him. She had stored that wanting in a small room and locked the door, but the door was not soundproof. On the occasions when their hands brushed reaching for the same document, when he leaned past her shoulder in council to look at a map, and she could feel the heat of him, when he laughed, rarely, very rarely, a short, reluctant sound like something breaking free of its restraints, she felt the whole edifice of careful neutrality tremble in her chest. He had not explained himself. She had not asked again. 7 years. Some walls, she had concluded, were built with reasons, even if you couldn't see them. And then came the night of the Thornkeep solstice celebration, and the man called Darian Veth, and everything that had been carefully contained for 7 years was thrown into the air like a flock of startled birds, and not a single thing came down the way it had left the ground. The solstice celebration was the largest event in the Thornkeep calendar, 3 days of festivities that drew nobles, merchants, and dignitaries from territories across the region, filling the fortress with music and color and the complicated politics of proximity. Elara had organized it, as she organized most things, with the quiet, comprehensive efficiency that had become her signature. The decorations were perfect. The food was flawless. The orchestration of who sat where and who was introduced to whom was a masterwork of political choreography that Aldrich Vane, to his credit, had acknowledged with a small nod of genuine respect. On the second night, there was dancing. Elara danced with the appropriate people in the appropriate order. Lord Fenwick of the North Boroughs, the young Duke of Sela, the elven envoy from the western reaches, who moved with unsettling grace and told her she was wasted on the cold north. She laughed politely at that. She danced well. She always danced well. It was one of the things she had been trained for, one of the skills filed under ornamental but useful, and she had long since stopped being self-conscious about it. She did not dance with her husband. This was normal. Ronan was not a dancing man. He stood near the edge of the great hall with a cup he rarely drank from, watching the room with the territorial awareness of a man cataloging threats, occasionally exchanging words with council members, or visiting dignitaries, but never lingering, never relaxing, never being anything other than entirely, exhaustingly controlled. She was aware of him watching her. She was always aware of that. It was midway through the evening when Darien Veth found her. She knew who he was, a foreign envoy from the Veth territories to the south, recently arrived to discuss a trade negotiation. He was handsome in an obvious, self-aware way, with dark golden hair and the easy confidence of a man who had been found attractive for long enough to have built a personality around it. He was also, she had gathered from 2 days of pre-celebration briefings, intelligent and politically astute. He bowed over her hand with practiced elegance. "Your Majesty," he said, "I've been hoping for an introduction all evening." "Lord Veth," she said, "I trust you found your accommodation satisfactory?" "Everything here is more than satisfactory." He smiled. It was a deliberate smile. "Would your Majesty honor me with a dance?" The appropriate answer was yes. He was a foreign dignitary. This was a diplomatic event. Refusing would have been a slight she could neither justify nor afford. She danced with him. He was good at it, smooth and skillful, with a way of guiding that felt effortless, and he talked as he danced, which most of her partners didn't bother to do. He asked questions about the kingdom, about trade routes, about the Eastern agriculture reform she had implemented, genuinely interested, or performing genuine interest with enough skill to be indistinguishable. She found herself relaxing slightly, responding naturally, and was conscious as she did it that this was probably his intention, that he was an expert at making people comfortable. And then, between one measured step and the next, he said quietly, "Your Majesty, may I speak frankly?" "You may try," she said, careful now. "I've made some inquiries since my arrival." His voice was low, the music covering it from nearby ears. "I understand that the king has not, that your marriage has not produced an heir." Every muscle in her body went still while her feet continued their trained pattern. "The kingdom needs a successor," he continued, unhurried, watching her face with the calculating gentleness of someone delivering news they know will land hard. "And I suspect, forgive my presumption, that the difficulty may not be on your side." She said nothing. "I am proposing," Darien Veth said, his hand warm and steady on her waist, "a private arrangement, entirely discreet, of benefit to the kingdom and to you personally, and, I would hope, not entirely unpleasant for either of us." The music swelled around them. Candles blazed in their hundreds along the walls. The great hall was full of sound and light, and the warmth of 200 bodies, and Elara stood in the middle of it and felt, for one terrible, vertiginous moment, the specific gravity of temptation. Not for him. Not specifically for him. For the thing he was offering. The solution he was dangling in front of her like a key to a lock she had been pressing against for 7 years. A child. An heir. An end to the whispers and the locked doors and the particular hollow grief of wanting something with no idea how to reach it. A child. Something that was hers, really hers, growing and breathing and alive. She felt it, the pull of it, the yes rising in her throat before her mind had even fully caught up with what she was considering. And then she looked across the hall. Ronan was already looking at her. He was not looking at the room in his usual cataloging way. He was looking at her. Directly, completely, with an intensity she had never seen from him in 7 years of standing in rooms together. His face was utterly still, the way stone is still before it fractures, and his hands, she saw his hands from across the distance of the room, were closed at his sides in fists so tight the knuckles had gone white. The yes died in her throat. Whatever she was about to say to Darien Veth, she never said it, because the music stopped. Because Ronan Thorne crossed the floor. He moved through the crowd the way fire moves through a field, not running, not hurrying, simply advancing with a certainty that parted people before him without a word. She watched him come and thought, wildly, this is who he is when the control breaks. And the thought was equal parts frightening and something she had no honest name for. He reached them. He was a full head taller than Darien Veth, broader by half, and he looked at the foreign envoy with an expression that turned the entire hall cold. "Lord Veth," he said. The voice was quiet. The quiet was worse than shouting. Darien Veth, to his credit, did not back away immediately. His smile held, though it had taken on a careful quality. "Your Majesty, this dance," Ronan said, "is finished." Veth's hand left her waist. He stepped back. He bowed, smooth, composed, revealing nothing of what had been said, and retreated into the crowd, which swallowed him. Elara stood in the center of the silent hall and looked at her husband. "We are leaving," Ronan said, and his voice was still quiet, still terrible, still that particular controlled thing that wasn't quite control anymore. He did not touch her. He walked beside her, close, very close, his body a wall of heat beside her arm, and the court parted for them, and the music did not start again until they had passed through the great doors. In the corridor, walking fast, neither of them speaking, Elara felt the words she had swallowed all evening beginning to rise. "Stop," she said. He stopped. They faced each other in the dim corridor, alone for the first time in she couldn't remember how long, and the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full, packed tight with 7 years of everything unsaid. 7 years, she said. Her voice shook slightly, which she hadn't planned. 7 years of closed doors and protocol and silence and being called barren by a court that doesn't know our bed has never been shared. 7 years of asking nothing. And tonight She stopped, steadied. Tonight I wanted to say yes to him. For one moment I wanted to say yes. Not because I want him, but because I'm 30 years old and I want a child, and you have never. Don't. The word cut across hers like a blade. Low, ragged. Don't what? Don't be honest? Don't have needs? Don't tell me you wanted to say yes to him. His voice had changed. The controlled quiet was cracking all the way through it now, like ice under weight, and what was beneath it was something she had never heard from him before, something raw and badly restrained and threaded through with something that sounded impossibly like pain. "Because if you tell me that, I cannot—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I cannot be responsible for what I do next." She stared at him. "Ronan," she said carefully. "Look at me." He was looking at the wall beside her head, the way he always did when avoiding direct contact, the way that had infuriated her for 7 years. She reached out, the first time she had voluntarily touched him outside of formal occasions, and put her hand against his jaw and turned his face toward hers. He let her. That was what stopped her breath. He let her. His eyes met hers, and she saw it. Finally, after 7 years of locked doors and empty beds and a court's cruel arithmetic, she saw what was in them. And it was not indifference. It was the opposite of indifference. It was want, enormous and carefully rationed and kept behind walls she was beginning to understand had been built not against her, but for her, around something Ronan was terrified of releasing because of what it might do. His hands came up and took her wrist, not pulling her hand away, but holding it, his fingers curled around her pulse point where it beat fast and visible. "Come to my chambers tonight," he said, rough and low, and nothing like a command. "Not the usual hour, not the usual protocol. Tonight, after the celebration ends." His thumb moved against her wrist, just once, just barely. "Please." It was the please that undid her. In 7 years, Ronan Thorne had never said please to her, had never said please to anyone as far as she knew. It was not a word that fit his architecture. "All right," she said. He released her wrist. The distance between them returned, and he was the king again. Controlled, composed. The walls up, and the expression neutral. But she had seen behind them. She went back to the celebration. She finished the evening. She smiled and danced and deflected inquiries about her early departure from the hall, and she did all of it on automatic because her mind was somewhere else entirely, turning over the look she had seen in his eyes like a stone. You found that might be worth something, examining it from every angle, not quite able to believe it. He wanted her. After 7 years, she finally knew. He had always wanted her. The question was why the hell it had taken this long for her to find out. She crossed back toward the great hall as the night deepened around the fortress, the sounds of the celebration rolling out beneath the door, and she thought, tonight, finally, I will have my answer. She did not know yet that the answer would be more complicated and more dangerous and more world-altering than anything she had prepared herself for. She did not know that the reason behind 7 years of locked doors was not coldness and not cruelty and not even cowardice. It was something far older, far darker. A bargain made before she ever walked through the fortress gates. But that was still hours away, and for now the night air was cold against her skin, and her pulse was fast, and after 7 long years of silence, the Queen of Thornkeep finally knew that she was wanted. She walked back through the door with her chin up and her shoulders back, and if she was smiling slightly, a real smile, not the performed one, no one in the court was close enough to notice the difference. The celebration didn't end until the 3rd bell past midnight. Elara knew because she counted every bell, standing at her window with a cup of cooling tea between her palms, watching the lights in the great hall slowly extinguish one by one as the last of the guests found their way to guest quarters or carriages or the warm arms of whatever companion they'd acquired over 3 days of festivity. The fortress settled into itself the way old stones do, slowly, with small sounds, like a sleeping giant adjusting its weight. She changed out of her celebration gown without calling for Mira. She didn't want company, didn't want conversation or careful questions or the particular look Mira had been giving her all evening, the watchful, worried look of a woman who had noticed the early departure from the hall and was keeping her own counsel about what it meant. She put on a plain wool robe, dark blue, and she sat in her chair and she waited. At the 4th bell, she stood up. The corridor was empty. The torches had been reduced to their night setting, low and amber, throwing more shadow than light. Her bare feet made no sound on the stone. She had made this walk 100 times in 7 years, and every one of those times had ended in the anteroom, or beside a sleeping man, or in the cold corridor on the other side of a locked door. Tonight, the door was unlocked. Not just unlocked, open. A thin blade of firelight cut across the corridor from a door left ajar by perhaps an inch, as if someone had checked and then deliberately left it so. Elara pushed it open and stepped inside. Ronan was awake. He was standing at the fireplace, one forearm braced against the mantel, looking into the fire with the focused stillness of a man who has been having a very serious argument with himself and hasn't yet decided who won. He was still dressed, shirt and trousers, no jacket, no formal armor of clothing, and when she entered, he didn't turn immediately. He gave it a count of 3, as if he needed those 3 seconds for something. Then he turned. "You came," he said. "You asked me to." She let the door close behind her. "You said please." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, and not quite a smile, but the ghost of something that might have been one in a less complicated man. "Sit down," he said. "I've been sitting all evening." "Then stand." He moved away from the fireplace, crossing to the small table where a decanter sat with 2 unused cups. He poured without asking, brought one to her. Their fingers brushed on the transfer, and neither of them commented on it. She drank. He didn't. "You're going to tell me," she said, "why the door has been locked?" "Yes. Tonight. Yes." He set his cup down on the mantel. He turned toward the fire again, and she understood that it was easier for him to say hard things when he wasn't looking at her. That this was not evasion, but a kind of practical self-management, the way you might stand upwind of something dangerous. "What I'm going to tell you will not be easy to hear. Some of it, I don't expect you to forgive." Her chest tightened. "Tell me anyway." He was quiet for a moment. Just the fire. Just the sound of the fortress around them. Old stone and old wood, and the wind moving outside the narrow windows. "When I was 19, he said, "I nearly destroyed this kingdom." She hadn't expected that. Whatever she'd braced for, coldness, rejection, some clinical explanation about duty and bloodlines, it hadn't been that. She waited. "The alpha transition," he continued, his voice low and steady, with the careful cadence of a man reciting something he has gone over many times alone, is not what the court histories describe it as. It isn't a ceremony. It isn't a title passing from father to son. It is... He stopped. His jaw worked. There is a force in the Thorn bloodline. It has been in every king before me. It is what makes us what we are. The strength, the bond with the pack, the territorial instinct. But it is not tame. It is not reasonable. And when it fully manifests, if the alpha is not bonded to a true mate, it does not stabilize. The word mate landed in the room with particular weight. Elara kept very still. "My father had my mother," Ronan said. The bond grounded him. It always grounded the kings before him. But my mother died when I was 16, and by the time the transition came for me, there was no one. He paused. The Force has no... It does not distinguish. It only wants. And what it wanted, what it would have done if I hadn't... He exhaled, sharp and controlled. There were 3 villages on the northern border. In the 3 days before I managed to lock it down, before the council found a way to contain it temporarily, I nearly... Ronan. Nearly leveled them, he said flatly. Not from malice, not from decision, just from the force of it, the pure territorial imperative, everything that makes an alpha a king turned inward and burning. My counsel pulled me back. Barely. He turned from the fire finally and looked at her, and the look was direct in the way that painful things are direct. Not softened, not managed. I have kept it contained since then. 17 years of containment. It is not natural. It causes... He gestured slightly at himself. The distance you have experienced, the control I keep. It is not coldness, Elara. It is the opposite. She was very quiet, processing. You are my true mate, he said. And the words came out differently from the other words. Quieter, stripped of their clinical framing, something underneath them that was raw and careful and very old. I have known it since the day you walked toward me at that altar. The pull toward you has been... It is not something I can describe neutrally. And every moment I have spent in the same room as you for 7 years has required a degree of control that I would not recommend to anyone. A pause. Touching you would begin the bonding. Fully bonding would release the force. And without something in place to contain what comes after... It would happen again, she said. The villages. Worse, he said simply. You would be at the center of it. The fire crackled. The wind pressed against the windows. Elara looked at her husband, at this man she had lived beside for 7 years and never touched and never understood. And she felt the 7 years rearranging themselves in her mind, every locked door and every measured distance recontextualizing into something that was not, after all, rejection. Every moment of his controlled stillness reread as an act of will she could barely comprehend. He had wanted her every day of those 7 years, and every day of those 7 years he had chosen to keep the door locked, because the alternative was something he didn't trust himself not to unleash. You should have told me, she said. I know. From the beginning. This was something I had the right to know. I know that too. No deflection, no justification, just, I know. I didn't know how to explain it without frightening you, and then time passed and explaining became harder and He stopped. Something honest crossed his face, something that looked, briefly, like shame. I told myself the control would hold indefinitely, that it was sustainable, that I was managing it. And tonight? The question landed between them. Tonight, Ronan said, and his voice changed again. Lower, something pulling against its restraints. I watched that man put his hands on you and propose what he proposed, and He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the firelight caught something in them that made the breath catch in her throat. The control is not, at this moment, what it was this morning. How close? She asked. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it. Close enough that you should probably leave, he said. And close enough that He stopped. The honest thing crossed his face again, harder this time. I don't want you to. The silence that followed was different from all the silences in the years behind them. It was not empty. It was full in the way that rooms are full before storms, charged, waiting, containing something that pressed against every surface, looking for the exit. Elara looked at him. She looked at the man who had locked his door for 7 years to keep her safe from something she hadn't known existed, who had sat across from her in council and watched her walk into rooms and listened to her argue with his lords and held himself apart by an act of will so enormous and sustained it qualified, she thought, as a kind of heroism. Who had said please and meant it in a way that had undone 17 years of carefully maintained distance in a single syllable? Tell me one thing, she said. Anything. If the bond were complete, if you stopped containing it, would you hurt me? He looked at her for a long time. Something worked in his face. "No," he said. "Never. Whatever else it does, whatever force comes with it, you are my mate. It would not turn against you." A pause. "It would only ever turn for you." She set down her cup. Then, she said carefully, "Perhaps the question is not whether to open the door. Perhaps the question is what we do when we open it." Ronan stared at her. "There has to be a way," she said. "You said your council contained it 17 years ago. You said the bond ground's an alpha, that it's what makes it stable. That's what happened with your father, with the kings before him, which means the force itself isn't the problem. The problem has been trying to hold it without the bond." She met his eyes directly. "Stop trying to manage the fire from outside the room and let me in." "Elara, I am not afraid of you." "You should be." "Probably." She lifted her chin. "I'm also 30 years old, and I have spent 7 years in this fortress, and I am tired," she said, quiet and level and absolutely certain, "of being afraid of wanting my own life." Something broke in his face. Not violently, not the way things break under sudden force, but the slow giving way of something that has been held rigid for too long, a gradual surrender to the reality of its own weight. He crossed the distance between them in 3 steps, and his hand came up to the side of her face, palm against her jaw, and he looked at her from close range the way he had never allowed himself to look before, direct and total, and nothing held back. "If this goes wrong," he said, rough and low, "if I cannot, then we manage it together," she said. "We have managed everything else together." He kissed her, not gently, not the courteous press of lips against a hand or a cheek that had been the whole vocabulary of their physical marriage for 7 years. He kissed her the way a man kisses something he has been keeping himself from for long enough that the keeping has become its own kind of agony. With the full weight of all that time, all that restraint, all that want that had been building in the dark for years without a door to go through. She kissed him back, and something in the room, something in the air, in the fire, in the space between their bodies, shifted. It was not frightening. It was the opposite of frightening. It was the specific feeling of a door opening after years locked shut, and the room on the other side being exactly what you had hoped it might be. Warm and full, and finally real. Whatever happened after that, whatever came with it, whatever bargain and sorceress and old debt would arrive eventually to collect, that was later. That was morning. That was the other side of this night. For now, in the firelit chamber at the heart of Thornkeep Fortress, the queen and her alpha king stopped managing the distance between them, and the silence that had lasted 7 years finally, irrevocably, ended. Morning came gray and quiet, fog pressing against the fortress windows like something trying to get in. Elara woke first. She lay still for a moment, oriented, cataloging the unfamiliar, the weight of a different room's darkness, the sound of someone else's breathing, the specific warmth of a body beside hers that she had never in 7 years had occasion to know. Ronan slept on his side, facing her, one hand open on the pillow between them, his face slack in the particular undefended way that sleep produces in people who spend their waking hours defended at every point. She studied him. She allowed herself to do this carefully and completely, the way you look at something when you finally have permission. He looked younger asleep. Or not younger, less armored. The lines of his face were the same lines she had been watching for 7 years across council tables and at state dinners. But without the controlled stillness, they were just features, human features, belonging to a man who snored very quietly and had one of his hands fisted slightly in the pillow. She had never imagined this, had sealed that particular imagination up early and kept it sealed. The version of this she had half dreamed, half feared in the first year of their marriage, the ordinary domesticity of waking beside someone, of being known in the small, unguarded ways that proximity allows. She had let go of it so thoroughly that its reality now felt slightly unreal, like something happening at one remove. "My mate," Ronan had said, and the word had sounded different from every other word he'd ever said to her, and she understood now why. It wasn't a title or a role or a diplomatic designation. It was a recognition, something older than language identifying something it had always known. She wondered if she would feel it too. The bond he'd described, the force, whatever it was that lived in the Thorn bloodline and had nearly destroyed 3 villages and 17 years of one man's careful self-management. She waited for something, some new awareness or altered perception. What she felt was quieter than she'd expected. Not nothing. She was warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire, aware of him with a clarity that went a little beyond the ordinary. When his hand twitched slightly in sleep, she felt it before she saw it, some peripheral sense tuned to a frequency it hadn't known existed yesterday. She got up carefully so as not to wake him. She needed to think. She was good at thinking, and there was a great deal to think about. By mid-morning, the celebration's final day was underway. The closing ceremonies, the formal farewell addresses, the long, complicated choreography of departing delegations. Elara stood at Ronan's side through all of it, as she always had, performing the role with the ease of long practice. She smiled at the right moments. She said the right things. She watched Darion Veth make his farewell bow, his eyes meeting hers briefly, something carefully unreadable in them before he looked away, and felt nothing toward him except a mild, distant pity for a man who had misjudged the room. Ronan stood beside her and did not touch her. They were in public, and 7 years of certain behavior is not undone in one morning. But his shoulder was closer to hers than it had ever been at a formal occasion. And once, when an irritating minor lord from the Western Territories spent 7 minutes telling her a story she had already heard, she felt Ronan shift incrementally between them and watched the lord abruptly remember he had somewhere to be. She pressed her lips together to keep the smile contained. "That was deliberate," she said quietly, once the lord had retreated. "I don't know what you mean," Ronan said, his voice perfectly neutral. "Yes, you do." A pause. "He was boring you." "He bores everyone. You've never intervened before." Another pause, longer. "I have not," Ronan said carefully, "been in a position before to find it difficult to watch someone bore you." She looked at him. He was looking ahead at the departing delegation with his most impenetrable expression. "Ronan," she said. "Are you going to talk to me about last night?" A long beat. "I would rather not do it here." "Then tonight?" "Yes," he said. "Tonight." It was not much. 7 years of silence was not undone by a single word, but yes was a beginning, and she had learned a long time ago to value beginnings. The court noticed. She hadn't expected it to be so fast, but of course it was. Courts are ecosystems of observation, and any deviation from established pattern registers immediately in the collective consciousness of people whose survival has always depended on reading the room correctly. By afternoon, she could feel it, the slightly different quality of attention when she and Ronan stood near each other, the whispers that stopped when she entered a room, the way Aldrich Vane looked at both of them during the closing council session with the expression of a man furiously revising his working assumptions. Lady Corvin, the wife of the Eastern Lord and the court's most reliable vector of social intelligence, found Elara near the end of the afternoon. "Your Majesty," she said, in the warm, purring tone she used when she was most interested, "you look well today." "Thank you, Lady Corvin." "Remarkably well." A significant pause. "There is something, forgive me, a brightness about you. Something changed." Elara smiled pleasantly. "It was a fine celebration. I'm pleased with how it came together." Lady Corvin's eyes assessed her with the precision of a practiced reader of surfaces. She said, noncommittally. And then, lowering her voice to the register that meant she was about to say something she would deny later. "The court will be watching the Queen rather closely in the coming weeks, I think, after last night's event with the envoy." "The court is welcome to watch," Elara said. "I imagine they'll find it rather uneventful." Lady Corvin smiled. It was the smile of a woman who did not believe this for a moment, but was gracious enough not to press. "Of course," she said. "Good day, Your Majesty." She walked away, and Elara kept her pleasant expression in place until the woman was out of eyeline, and then let it settle into something more honest. The court was watching. Good. Let them watch. Let them look for 7 more years of nothing and find instead, whatever this was, whatever came next. She wasn't sure yet, But she knew, with the bone-deep certainty of a woman who had learned to trust her own judgment over years of having it dismissed, that something had changed, something foundational. The question of what happened next felt less like a threat and more like a horizon, out there, not yet visible, but coming toward her at a pace she could prepare for. She was wrong about that. She just didn't know it yet. 3 days after the celebration, Ronan didn't come to dinner. This was unusual but not alarming. He missed meals occasionally when council business ran long, or when something on the borders required immediate attention. Elara ate with Mira and two of the junior ladies, and the conversation was light, and she went to her rooms afterward and read for an hour before Mira came to the door with the specific look that meant news. "His Majesty's man is at the door," Mira said. "Breck, he says the king has asked that no one enter the private wing tonight." Elara set down her book. "Is he ill?" Breck didn't say. Mira's expression was carefully neutral, but her eyes were not. "He said the king was, managing something, and that your Majesty should rest, and that all was well." Managing something. The phrasing was Ronan's. She recognized it. She put on her robe and went to the corridor anyway. Breck was at his post, and the look on his face when she appeared was not quite relief, and not quite distress, but something composite of both. "Your Majesty," he said. His Majesty asked, "I heard what he asked." She held Breck's gaze. He had been Ronan's man for 12 years, utterly loyal, and she respected that. "Is he safe?" A pause. "For now." "Is this—" She chose her words carefully. "Is this something that has happened before?" Breck looked at the door, looked at her. Something in him made a decision. "3 times in the past year," he said quietly. "It passes. It always passes. By morning, let me in. My lady, the king specifically." "Breck," she said, and her voice was gentle but absolute. "I know what this is, and I know now what addresses it. Let me in." Another pause, longer this time. She watched the guard work through his competing loyalties with the visible effort of a man who has trained for one scenario and been handed another. He stepped aside. The antechamber was dark and cold, the fire not lit, no candles, the only light the pale silver of overcast moonlight through the high window. She crossed it to the bedroom door and pushed it open. The bedroom was not dark. It was— strange was the word her mind produced, inadequate but the closest she had. The air in the room was different from the air in the corridor, heavier with something that wasn't heat exactly, but carried the quality of heat, a pressure that she felt against her skin when she stepped through the door. The fireplace was blazing despite no one having tended it, the flames higher than any natural fire should reasonably be without fuel recently added. Ronan was on the far side of the room, in the corner farthest from the door, sitting against the wall with his knees drawn up and his head bowed. He was breathing audibly, slow and deliberate, each breath the carefully measured respiration of a man counting. He didn't look up when she entered. "Go back," he said, rough and strained. "Elara, go back." "No," she said, for the second time in 3 days. "This is not—" His breath hitched. "This is what I warned you about. The bond opened something. I'm managing it, I will manage it, but you need to not be in this room. Look at me," she said. "I cannot," he said, and his voice cracked on the word in a way she had never heard from him. Something under it that was pain, genuine pain, not metaphorical. "If I look at you right now, I cannot guarantee—" She crossed the room. She was not afraid. She had examined this question the night she told him she wasn't afraid of him, and had found the examination to return a genuine answer rather than a brave performance. She understood now what the force was. Not malevolence, not predation, but something more like a fire that had been contained so long in a small space that its release was violent by default, not design. It didn't want to destroy. It had just never been taught any other way to want. She sat down on the floor in front of him. He made a sound, low, involuntary, his hands going flat against the stone. "I'm here," she said, and she put her hand over one of his. The effect was immediate and visible. His breathing changed, the careful counting rhythm interrupted and replaced by something deeper, slower, less managed, and more real. The temperature in the room shifted, the oppressive pressure easing by increments. She felt it in her own chest, a tugging, resonant sensation, like being pulled towards something by a cord she hadn't known was there. The bond grounding him, she realized, like his father, like the kings before. That's what it needs. Not distance, proximity, not control, connection. "Ronan," she said quietly, "look at me." He lifted his head. His eyes were different. She had no other word for it. Still his eyes, the same dark gray she had been reading for 7 years. But the quality of the light in them was altered, like deep water disturbed from below. He looked at her with an expression that was beyond language, past the reach of any of the words they had accumulated in 7 years of careful conversation. "I'm all right," she told him. "And you're all right. And it's all right." His forehead dropped to hers. They stayed like that, on the floor in the corner, foreheads touching, her hand over his, for a long time. The fire settled. The room's pressure dissipated. His breathing slowly, incrementally, came back to something human. He didn't speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I should have told you years ago," he said. "I should have—" "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I was afraid." "I know." She did know. She'd had 7 years to learn the architecture of his fear, even without knowing what built it. "But I'm here now. Whatever this is, we manage it together. That's what I said, and I meant it." He exhaled, long and slow, and something in it that sounded like relief so profound it had become its own kind of grief. "There are things you still don't know," he said. "Things about the situation, a complication." He stopped. "Tell me." "Not tonight." He pulled back enough to look at her properly. "I will tell you. I promise you that. But not tonight." She searched his face. Whatever the complication was, it was real. She could see it in the tightness around his eyes, something that wasn't the force but was connected to it, something that had been sitting behind his expression for years before she knew to look for it. "Soon," she said. "Soon," he agreed. She believed him. She believed him because he had kept his word every time it mattered, even when keeping it meant a 7-year silence she'd misread as indifference. Because whatever he was keeping from her, it wasn't from cowardice or cruelty. She knew that now. Whatever the thing was that sat at the back of his eyes and made the word complication come out like the weight of something enormous, it was something he had been carrying alone. She thought, he does not need to carry it alone anymore. She thought, whatever it is, we will manage it. Outside the fortress walls, the autumn wind drove the last of the season's leaves from the trees and pressed them against cold stone, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the light, something older than either of them, something that had been waiting a very specific number of years, checked the count and found it nearly complete. But inside the room, with the fire burning naturally now and the worst of it past, Elara stayed where she was, her hand over her husband's, and let herself believe for the first time in 7 years that the worst was behind them. She was only partly wrong. The worst was not behind them. It was ahead. It had a face and a name, and it would arrive at the castle gates in a dress the color of smoke, carrying a debt that had come due. But that arrival was still some weeks away, and what stood between now and then was something Elara had waited 7 years for. The simple, extraordinary ordinary of not being alone. She was not going to waste a single hour of it. The weeks that followed were unlike anything in the 7 years before them. Not dramatic, not transformed overnight into something unrecognizable, but changed in the way that light changes when a cloud moves off the sun. The same landscape, entirely different quality of visibility. Elara noticed it in small things first. The way Ronan appeared in her doorway in the evenings without announcement, settling into the chair across from hers with a book or a council brief, as if he had always done this. The way he began staying for dinner instead of sending his courteous regrets. The way he looked at her in council now, not past her shoulder, not at the middle distance, but at her face. And when their eyes met, he didn't look away. The court noticed all of it immediately, collectively, and with the intensity of people who have been waiting 7 years for a plot to develop. Aldrich Vane requested a private audience with her in the second week of this new arrangement. He was 71 years old, had served 3 generations of Thorn Kings, and had the face of a man who had seen enough history to be alarmed by very little of it. He sat across from her in the small council room with his hands folded on the table and his expression carefully calibrated to professional neutrality. "Your Majesty," he said, "the council is encouraged by recent developments between yourself and the king." "I'm glad to hear it," Elara said pleasantly. "We would naturally anticipate that if the situation were to result in news of an heir—" He paused, choosing his words with the care of a man navigating a minefield. "The council would appreciate being informed before the general court." "Of course. And we would want to ensure that the king's condition is well managed in the interim." He looked at her steadily. "You are aware of his condition?" "I am." A beat. Something shifted in Aldrich's expression. Surprise quickly banked. "I see. Then you understand that the transition from containment to—" "Lord Aldrich," she said, leaning forward slightly. "Are you asking me if I know what I'm doing?" The old man looked at her for a long moment. Then, to her genuine surprise, the corner of his mouth moved. "I am asking," he said, "whether your Majesty requires any assistance. The council has resources, knowledge about the Thorn bloodline that even the king may not have fully shared." A pause. "We have not always managed our relationship with you as well as we might have in the past years." It was the closest thing to an apology she would ever get from Aldrich Vane. She received it with the grace it deserved. "I welcome the council's support," she said, "and I will come to you if I need what you know." He nodded. Rose. At the door he paused. "You are better for him than we anticipated," he said without turning. "Better for the kingdom." Then he left, and she sat with the words for a moment before filing them under useful and moving on. Ronan told her about the medicine on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the solstice celebration. He came to her rooms with a small cedar box, the kind used for storing compounds, and set it on her writing desk without preamble. "What is this?" she asked. "Something the court physician has been preparing for me for years," he said, standing. "A compound. It stabilizes the force, not eliminates, not contains the way I've been containing it, but smooths it. Keeps the edges manageable without requiring the degree of active suppression that I've been maintaining." He looked at the box. "I refused to use it until now. The suppression was the control. I didn't trust anything that reduced the degree of active effort. And now?" He looked at her. "Now the bond provides what the suppression was substituting for. The compound can do the rest." He paused. "Aldrich thinks I should have been taking it for years. He is probably correct." She opened the cedar box. Inside, a row of small glass vials, each filled with something the dark amber color of autumn leaves. "1 vial in warm water each evening," Ronan said. "The physician says it takes 3 days to reach its full effect and should be taken consistently for at least the first year, while the bond stabilizes." "You could take it yourself," she observed. "I could." A beat. "I thought it would be easier to remember if it was part of your routine rather than mine." She looked up at him. He was looking slightly past her left ear, which was his tell. The direction his eyes went when he was saying something that cost him. What he was asking was not about medicine, and they both knew it. He was asking her to be the keeper of this, to hold something of his, to be the person who remembered, who managed it with him, who was woven into the daily maintenance of his stability in a way that couldn't be untangled without consequence. He was asking her to stay. "All right," she said softly. "I'll keep it." Something in his face settled. She brought the medicine to his chambers 12 days later. The evening had been long. A territorial dispute from the northern lords had occupied council for 6 hours, and she had argued 3 of those hours against Lord Fenwick's insistence on a military solution when a diplomatic one was achievable with significantly less blood. She had won, barely, and she arrived at Ronan's door with the cedar box under one arm and the specific exhaustion of a woman who has spent 6 hours being the most reasonable person in a room full of men who resented her for it. Breck let her in without question now. This had been true for 10 days. She had noticed but not remarked on it, had understood it as Breck's own form of acknowledgement, his practical acceptance of the new configuration. The antechamber was warm, the fire already built up, and she could hear Ronan in the inner room, the low sound of movement, the scrape of a chair. She knocked on the connecting door. "A moment," he said. She waited, set the cedar box on the side table, poured warm water from the carafe the servants always kept there. She had asked for this specifically, had arranged it through Breck, without making it a formal instruction, because small logistics were what she was good at. And she had learned long ago that the management of small logistics was not beneath the dignity of a queen, but was in fact one of the ways power expressed itself practically. Ronan opened the door. He had clearly been working, sleeves rolled, papers in one hand, the particular disheveled quality of a man who had not been expecting company as early as this. He looked at her, looked at the box, looked at the warm water she had already prepared. Something crossed his face that she had only learned to read recently. It was not gratitude exactly, it was recognition. The expression of someone seeing themselves reflected in an action that confirms they are known. "You're early," he said. "The council ended. I heard it ran long. Fenwick again?" "Fenwick always." She opened the cedar box, drew out a vial, tipped it into the warm water. The amber color dissolved and spread. She held the cup toward him. "Drink." He took it, drank, made the brief expression of a man accepting something unpleasant for practical reasons. "It's not that bad," she said. "It tastes like the eastern marshes smell." "The eastern marshes smell like poor water management, which I have now addressed, so perhaps in a year it will taste better." She took the cup back. He almost smiled, almost, not quite, the expression that in Ronan Thorne was the functional equivalent of laughing. She was restoring the box when it happened. It was not dramatic, not heralded. It arrived the way certain significant things arrive, quietly, tucked inside an ordinary moment, only recognizable afterward. She set the box down and felt, dizzy was not the right word. It was more specific than that. A sudden acute awareness of her own body, some shift in the interior landscape that was distinct enough to stop her hand mid-motion. She stood very still. Ronan was watching her. She could feel it without looking. "Elara," his voice had changed register. "I'm fine," she said automatically. "You're not fine. You've gone pale." She turned to look at him. He was standing very close. Had crossed toward her at some point, drawn by whatever instinct the bond had woken in him. His eyes were reading her face with the focused intensity he usually directed at territorial maps or council briefs. "Sit down," he said. She sat down. Not because he'd asked, but because her legs had apparently made their own decision. She sat in the chair by the fire and put her hands in her lap and tried to identify what she was feeling. The dizziness passed. What replaced it was something she didn't have a word for. A new quality, like an additional sense opening, or a room being added to a house, or a chord being played that had been missing a note and now wasn't. She looked at her hands. "Ronan," she said. "Yes." "How long?" she said carefully. "After the bond is complete. How long before—" She stopped. Ronan crouched in front of her chair, putting himself at her eye level, and his expression was doing something she had never seen it do before. Something stripped of every performance and protocol, something unguarded in the absolute way that only terror and love can strip a face of its management. "How long before what?" he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. She looked at him. "Before a child is possible," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "Or before one is—" The word didn't come. She didn't need it. He was already reading her face. His breath left him. "The bond," he said slowly, it accelerates certain things. The connection between true mates." He stopped. His eyes dropped to her hands, then back to her face. "It isn't— Normally it takes weeks before—" "The bond has been complete for 3 weeks," she said. Silence. "Elara." He said her name like it was the only word he knew. "I don't know for certain," she said. "I can't be certain yet, but she exhaled. "I know my body." And something has changed. Something is different. He reached out and took both her hands in his. His hands were warm, steady, where hers were not. He looked at her with an expression so undefended and enormous that she felt it press against the inside of her chest. Is this... He stopped, tried again. Are you... I don't know how I feel yet, she said honestly. I think I need a moment. Take as many as you need. She looked at their joined hands. She thought about 7 years. She thought about the market square and the boy with the solemn eyes and his father sweeping him up laughing. She thought about the word barren spoken on the other side of a tapestry by a woman who didn't know what she was saying. Then she thought about this room, this fire, this man who had built 7 years of walls to protect her from something he was afraid of and was now crouching on the floor in front of her chair, holding her hands as if she might disappear. I think, she said slowly, that I am carefully optimistic. Something broke open in his face, not violently. The same slow yielding she had seen the night the walls first came down, the gradual surrender to something too large to keep managing. He pressed his forehead to her hands, both of them, and she felt his breath against her knuckles. They stayed like that for a long time. 3 more weeks passed before she was certain. By then the signs were undeniable to her body and confirmed by the court physician, who spent a great deal of the examination with the expression of a man recalibrating everything he had assumed for the past 7 years. He was a decent man, and he had the decency to look ashamed of the medical conclusions he had drawn previously, or the conclusions he had allowed others to draw without correction. Your Majesty is in excellent health, he said carefully at the end, and the timing is consistent with recent events, she said, because she was not going to give him any more than that. Yes. He closed his case. Congratulations, Your Majesty. She told Ronan that evening. She had thought about how, whether to make it a formal announcement, whether to have the physician present, whether to frame it as political news or personal news, or some carefully managed composite of both. She ended up doing none of that. She walked to his study where he was working late, opened the door without knocking, and said, It's confirmed. He looked up from his papers. She watched him understand, watched the understanding move through his face in stages. Comprehension, then something too large for his expression to contain, then the visible effort to contain it, then the failure of that effort, and then just the raw thing itself, unmanaged, present. He stood up. He crossed the room in 5 steps and put his hands on her face, tilting her head back to look at her directly. And what was in his eyes was not the dangerous fire she had spent weeks learning to work alongside. It was something else entirely, something quieter and deeper and more permanent. You are all right, he said, not a question, checking. I am very all right, she confirmed. He kissed her, careful this time. Something in it that was entirely different from the fierce desperation of the night 7 weeks ago. This was something that knew it had time, something that had been given a future, and was choosing to move into it slowly. She felt, against her cheek, the specific warmth of his hands. She thought, I was right. This was worth waiting for, even 7 years of waiting. She told Mira the next morning. Mira cried, which was unexpected. Mira was not a crier, had in fact observed several crisis situations over the past 7 years with a dry-eyed practicality that Elara had always respected and slightly envied. The tears lasted approximately 4 seconds before Mira collected herself with the dignity of a woman who takes her own emotional management seriously. I knew it, Mira said, pressing her fingers briefly under her eyes. I knew, from the celebration, the way you came back that night, I knew something had finally... You knew nothing, Elara said, not unkindly. I knew something. Mira handed her a handkerchief that was nominally for Elara, but clearly for herself. Does the council know? Not yet. I'll tell Aldrich today. He'll be insufferably smug. He's been saying for 3 years that you and the king needed only... Mira. Right. Yes. She straightened. The familiar, competent Mira reassembled herself. What do you need? I need you to behave exactly as normal until I've told the council, Elara said. And then I need you to help me manage whatever the court does when they hear it." "They'll lose their minds," Mira said with satisfaction. "Probably." Elara almost smiled. "Isn't that their right?" Aldrich Vane, when she told him, went very still in his chair. Then he did something she had never seen him do in 7 years. He closed his eyes, just for a moment. Something in his face that was relief, genuine and unperformed, the kind that only comes from putting down something you've been carrying for a very long time. "Your Majesty," he said when he opened them, This is the best news in 17 years." "I'll tell the king you said so," she said. "He knows." Aldrich looked at her steadily. "He has always known what was at stake, what it cost him to wait." A pause. "What it cost you both." She received this without comment, nodded once. "Tell me what the council needs," she said. "Procedure, protocol, what the announcement should look like. I'll need your guidance." The old man looked at her, the assessing, calibrating look she had been on the receiving end of for 7 years, the look that had started as politely underwhelmed and had traveled a very long distance since then. "Your Majesty needs nothing from the council," he said quietly. "You know exactly what to do. You have always known exactly what to do." He rose with the careful deliberateness of an old man who had stopped pretending his bones didn't ache. Forgive an old advisor his assumption that the Queen required managing. It was the full apology, finally. She took it. "You were doing your job," she said. "So was I." He nodded and left, and she sat in the small council room alone for a moment, with the news of her child inside her like a lamp lit against a long dark. The announcement was made to the court 4 days later. The reaction was comprehensive. The whispers that had said barren for 7 years were silenced overnight, replaced by something louder and more complicated, the noise of an entire court reconfiguring its assumptions. She watched it happen from the high table at the formal dinner that followed the announcement, watched the faces. Surprise giving way to recalculation, recalculation giving way to something that on some faces looked like genuine joy, and on other faces looked like the careful management of being wrong in public. Lady Corvin looked at her from across the room with an expression of pure acknowledgement, the look of one political operator recognizing another. She raised her cup. Elara inclined her head. Beside her, Ronan sat with his hand close to hers on the table, not touching because they were in public, and he was still learning to adjust the 7-year habits of careful distance, but close. Close enough that their fingers were barely apart, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his hand even without contact. She moved her hand a fraction. Their fingers touched, under the table, invisible to the court. Just the contact, just his hand and hers, quietly, in the middle of the noise of 200 people recalibrating their version of her life. He didn't move away. The weeks that followed were, she would remember them later as the best weeks of her marriage. Not perfect, not uncomplicated. She was tired in the particular consuming way of early pregnancy, and the court's attention had a weight to it now that was different from the dismissive weight of the years before. Before, they had watched her with the mild interest due a queen who was failing to produce. Now they watched her with the focused intensity of people monitoring an asset. She was the vessel of the succession. The conversation had shifted from will she to when and what if, and the particular anxious calculus of people who have invested in an outcome. She navigated it the way she navigated everything, with the careful, comprehensive competence that was her primary instrument of survival. She worked. She ruled. She managed the Eastern grain dispute's aftermath and the ongoing border negotiations and the flood damage in the lower districts, which required 3 site visits in weather that was becoming increasingly hostile as autumn deepened toward winter. She also, for the first time in 7 years, slept without the particular specific loneliness that had been her most constant companion. This was not a small thing. She didn't make it small. Ian. It was on a morning in the 8th week that she woke to the sound of him in distress. Not the controlled kind, not the measured, counted breathing of a man actively managing something difficult. This was different. She came up out of sleep fast, oriented immediately by the bond, by the new awareness it had opened in her that was still strange and not yet fully mapped, but was reliable in the way that certain kinds of knowing are reliable. Not louder than ordinary sense, just more direct. She crossed to the door between their rooms. They had begun, in the past weeks, the quiet, practical reconfiguration of two people cohabiting a space that had been divided. The door between their adjoining chambers was no longer locked from either side, and opened it. Ronan was sitting on the edge of the bed, awake, his head in his hands, his breathing the counted kind now, but having to work hard for it. The room was cold. The fire had gone out. "You didn't take the medicine last night," she said. Not an accusation, observation. "I fell asleep before, He stopped. "I forgot." "Ronan." "I know." He lifted his head. In the gray morning light he looked, not dangerous, tired. The eyes she had spent 7 years reading were exhausted in a way she hadn't seen before. Something in them that was not the force itself, but was the weight of managing it, the accumulated cost of 17 years of containment being paid in a different currency now that the containment was changing form. "Go get it." She went and got it, made the warm water, brought it back. He drank without comment. But he didn't lie back down, and she didn't leave. She sat beside him on the edge of the bed in the cold room, close enough for the warmth of the bond to do its quiet stabilizing work, and she waited. "There's something I have to tell you," he said. "I know." He looked at her. "You've been circling it for weeks," she said. "Whatever the complication is. Whatever you've been holding back since the night you first said you'd tell me." She met his eyes directly. "The child has changed the timeline, hasn't it? Something that was in the future is now closer." He was quiet for a long moment. "There is a woman," he said. "Or a figure. Something that presents as a woman. She is not human, not entirely. She has been known by different names in different territories. The council calls her the sorceress of the gray veil." He stopped. "I made a bargain with her before our marriage." The cold in the room was different from the lack of fire. "What kind of bargain?" Elara said, and her voice was perfectly level. "I was 24 years old," he said. "The force was not controlled. I had managed the worst of it after the near destruction at 19, but it was unstable. But God, it was escalating, and without a mate bond to stabilize it, the long-term prognosis was..." He exhaled. The council had exhausted every conventional option. Aldrich found her. She had a solution, a binding, something she called a delay seal, which could suppress the worst of the force long enough for me to function, to rule, to find a mate through proper channels rather than the forced bond path the force was pushing me toward. "And the cost," Elara said. He looked at her hands, which were folded in her lap. "The cost was..." She framed it as a time limit. 10 years from the date of my marriage, during which I was to not complete the mate bond. If I held to the terms, the seal would dissolve naturally at the end of the period, and I would be free. He paused. If I broke the terms before the 10 years were complete... "What?" Elara said quietly. "The first child of the bond," he said, "would belong to her." The word belong sat in the cold room and did not move. Elara felt the blood leave her face. She felt the bond in her chest, the warm, constant presence of the past weeks. And beneath it, under it, she felt the child. The new room added to the house of her body, and she felt both of these things at the same time as she processed the sentence her husband had just spoken, and the processing took time, longer than it should have. Because the mind, when confronted with something that rewrites the entire architecture of what it believed, has to perform a kind of structural demolition before it can begin to rebuild, and structural demolition cannot be hurried. 10 years, she said finally. Her voice was strange. Our marriage is... We have been married 7 years and 3 months. Yes. The bond was completed 8 weeks ago. Yes. Which means we broke the terms 2 years and 9 months before the seal would have dissolved. She looked at him. 2 years and 9 months before you were free. Yes, Ronan said, and his voice was the quiet of a man accepting a verdict. The celebration, she said. Darian Veth, that night, you... Something was clicking into place. the pieces of it assembling themselves with a logic she had not known to look for until this moment. The control broke that night. You said it yourself because of him touching me. Yes. You knew, she said. You knew what the terms were. You knew if the bond completed before 10 years. I knew. His voice was flat, not without feeling, but beyond it in the way that guilt goes when it has been lived with long enough to become simply part of the furniture. I made the decision consciously. I am not pretending otherwise. He looked at her directly because he owed her that. When I saw him with his hands on you, He stopped. I have made exactly one decision in my life that was not calculated. That was it. She looked at her hands in her lap. She was pregnant. She was 8 weeks pregnant with the first child of the bond. And somewhere, in the gray veil, or wherever such things waited, a bargain was now in breach. A clock that had been running for 7 years had reached its condition, and a sorceress who was not entirely human was owed a debt. Does she know? Elara asked. Does she already know the bond is complete? She will know, Ronan said quietly. They always know. When will she come? I don't... He stopped, reconsidered. Soon, within the year, before the child is born, most likely. They prefer to collect before the bond between a mother and child becomes... He stopped again. Becomes what? Her voice was edged now, something new in it. Unbreakable, he said simply. The fire was out and the room was cold, and Elara sat on the edge of the bed beside her husband in the gray morning light and felt the full weight of the past land on her in one comprehensive, breathless moment. All the locked doors and silent years and careful management, and at the bottom of all of it, this old debt with its terrible mathematics, this bargain that had kept her safe for 7 years by the mechanism of keeping her at arm's length, and had now come due because the thing it was meant to prevent had happened anyway. Because a foreign envoy had danced with her and a king who had been holding himself still for 17 years had finally, fatally moved. She looked at Ronan. Why, she said very quietly, did you not tell me this before the bond completed, before I... She didn't finish. He didn't flinch from the question. Because I had been telling myself the seal would hold, that I could manage the remaining time. He looked at his hands. And because the night you told me you wanted to say yes to him, I saw what the silence had cost you, what 7 years of it had cost. He looked up. I chose you. I chose this, knowing what it would cost. A pause. I chose wrong. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about what it meant to choose wrong from love, whether that category existed, whether choosing wrong and choosing love were always the same thing, or sometimes different ones. She thought about the child inside her and the sorceress in the gray veil and the 2 years and 9 months of freedom that had been traded for the particular moment of a king deciding that the woman beside him was worth the debt. She was furious. She held the fury carefully, the way you hold something hot, present in her hands, not dropped, not acted on before it was examined, and beneath the fury something else, something she would not name yet. We have time, she said finally. Some. Then we use it. She stood up. Her voice was steady, the years of practice behind it. We go to Aldrich. We go to everyone in this fortress who has knowledge of this, the gray veil, the sorceress, the terms of the seal. We find every piece of information available, and we... She stopped, turned back to him. There is always another way. There has always been another way when people were willing to look hard enough. The Eastern water dispute, the border negotiations, every problem that came to me already declared unsolvable. Elara, his voice was rough. This is not a territorial negotiation. She is not a lord with competing interests. Everything with competing interests can be negotiated, Elara said. I don't know yet what hers are, but I intend to find out. She crossed to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame. Get dressed. We're going to wake Aldrich. Ronan stared at her. Now, she said. He got up. She walked down the corridor toward the old advisor's quarters, with her back straight and her chin lifted and her heart hammering in her chest, at a speed that had nothing to do with composure, because composure was a performance, And this, what was happening in Shemur, was not. This was the specific animal fear of a woman who has been given something she wanted for 7 years and has now been told there is a condition, a deadline, a claim on it she didn't know to protect against. The fear was real. She held it in her chest and walked faster. Behind her she heard his door and his footsteps, and the particular sound of a man who has stopped managing the distance and started walking towards something instead. The fortress was still asleep around them, cold stone and winter dark, and somewhere beyond the walls a creditor was already counting down what was owed, and the Queen of Thornkeep was running out of time in a way she had never run out of it before. Not gradually, not ambiguously, but with the terrible clarity of a debt named and dated and coming. And she was not, she decided in the corridor in the gray winter dark, going to let it collect without a fight. She was not going to let it collect without a fight. And Aldrich Vane, when they woke him at the 5th bell of a winter morning, took one look at both of them standing in his doorway and stepped back without a word to let them in. He was already dressed. That was the first thing Elara noticed. Not in night clothes, not pulled from sleep, dressed in his full council attire, as if he had been expecting this conversation for some time and had simply been waiting for the knock. "You told her," he said to Ronan. "Yes." "Good." He moved to the fireplace, which was already lit, and gestured at the chairs. "Sit down, both of you. I've been waiting for this conversation for 7 years." Elara sat. Ronan did not. He stood near the door with his arms crossed, the particular tension in him that she had learned to read as something between shame and barely managed urgency. She looked at Aldrich. "You knew," she said, "about the bargain." "I brokered it," he said, without flinching. "I found the sorceress of the Grey Veil when my king was 24 years old and losing ground, and I brought her to him, and I read the terms of the seal before he signed it. And yes, I knew what the condition was." He looked at her steadily. "I believed at the time that 10 years was manageable, that the king would find his true mate, bond properly at the 10-year mark, and the condition would never be triggered." A pause. "I underestimated several things." "Including me," Elara said. "Including you," he agreed, and said it without embarrassment. "I thought the political marriage would remain political. I thought that the king's control was more absolute than it proved to be." He glanced at Ronan briefly. "I was wrong about a great many things. I have had 7 years to understand exactly how wrong." "Then help me fix it," Elara said. Aldrich looked at her for a moment. Then he crossed to his writing desk, opened the bottom drawer, and withdrew a file so thick it had been bound with 3 separate cords. He set it on the table between them. "I have been researching this since the week of the solstice celebration," he said. "Since I saw the two of you standing together in the corridor after you left the hall early, and I understood what had happened, or was about to happen." He untied the first cord. "I am old. I am not fast, but I am thorough, and I have had every resource in the Royal Archive at my disposal for 2 months." He opened the file. "Shall we begin?" They worked through the rest of the night and into the morning. The file contained 40 years of Aldrich's meticulous research into the Grey Veil sorceress, not a single individual, he explained, but a persistent entity that had appeared under different names across centuries of recorded history, always in the same capacity, offering solutions to alpha inheritance crises in exchange for terms that were always precisely calibrated to the point of maximum vulnerability. The Veil territories had records of her from 200 years ago. The Mountain Keeps had a reference 60 years before that. She found rulers at their weakest moment, and she offered exactly what they needed, and her terms were always designed around a condition that seemed unlikely to trigger. "She's not a demon," Aldrich said, turning pages. "Not in the traditional sense. She is a collector. She acquires. Children of true mate bonds carry a specific kind of power, the concentrated potential of 2 fated lines combined. She's been building something with them for centuries. We don't know what." "The children she collects," Elara said carefully. "What happens to them?" Aldrich paused on a page. "They are kept, not harmed, as far as we can determine from the records. Preserved." He looked up. "Which is somehow worse." Elara pressed her hand flat against the table. "The terms of the seal," she said. "You have them in writing?" A copy. Yes. He turned to a section near the back of the file and withdrew a single page, old and dense with careful script. She took it and read it, slowly, twice. The language was archaic in the way of things written to be binding rather than readable. Every word chosen for its precision, every clause constructed to close the gap it might leave. She read it the way she read bad contracts, looking for the seams, the places where language did not quite meet itself, the spaces between terms where a different interpretation might find purchase. She found 3. Here, she said, putting her finger on the page. The first child of the bond will belong to the sorceress of the Grey Veil. She looked at Aldrich. The word belong. In the territorial law of the Old Vale, which this document dates to, the script is pre-unification. What does belong mean in the context of a person? Aldrich leaned forward, studied the page. Something shifted in his expression. In pre-unification Vale law, he said slowly, belong in the context of personhood is a custodial term, not an ownership term. He looked up. It was used specifically in guardianship disputes. The child belongs to the mother, meaning the mother holds custodial rights. Not that the mother owns the child as property. Which means, Elara said, the term is legally custodial, not possessive. She is owed guardianship rights, not the child itself. A silence. That is a very fine distinction, Aldrich said carefully. Fine distinctions are what hold agreements together, Elara said. Or take them apart. What else does custodial transfer require? Under pre-unification Vale law, Aldrich was already moving to the bookshelves that lined 2 walls of his study, pulling volumes with the practiced speed of a man who knows his own library. Custodial transfer requires the willing relinquishment of the primary guardian, he said, scanning pages. A child cannot be transferred against the express will of a living, competent primary guardian unless— stopped. Unless, Elara said. He turned to look at her. His face had done something she had never seen it do in 7 years. It had gone still with something that was almost hope, in a man who had trained himself out of hope as a professional liability. Unless the primary guardian is dead, he said, or formally incapacitated, or has voluntarily surrendered guardianship in a witnessed ceremony. He set the book down. All 3 conditions require: the parent must be absent or have surrendered the right willingly. A living, present, unwilling parent cannot have custodial rights removed under pre-unification Vale law. He looked at Elara. She built her terms on old law. She used the old language. Because it was the language in use when she first wrote these contracts, Elara said, centuries ago. And she has been using the same template since. She may not have considered that someone would read it closely enough. She may not have expected a queen who spent 6 years fighting Eastern lords over water rights, Elara said, and her voice was steady and certain in a way that came not from bravado, but from the specific confidence of someone who has just found solid ground in what appeared to be open water. From the doorway, Ronan said, Elara. She looked at him. He was watching her with an expression she had seen only a handful of times. The expression she associated with the moments when something she did registered in him with a force he hadn't braced for. She had seen it the first time she stood up to Fenwick in council. She had seen it the night she sat on his floor and told him she wasn't afraid of him. She was seeing it now. This is a beginning, she said. Not a solution, but it's a beginning. She turned back to Aldrich. I need to know everything. Every clause, every condition, every piece of Old Vale law that touches this document, and I need to know when she's likely to come. I cannot know her timeline precisely, Aldrich said. Estimate. He calculated. The bond completed 8 weeks ago. She will know. She will want to collect before the child is born. A post-birth claim is more complicated, legally, even under her terms. He looked at the window, which was just beginning to lighten toward dawn. You are in your 3rd month. She will come before your 6th. 3 months, Elara said. Then we have 3 months. Possibly less. Then we start today. They started that day and did not stop. Elara requisitioned the entire east wing of the Royal Archive for her research, displacing 2 junior historians who were given other assignments and told nothing specific. She worked with Aldrich every morning, going through the pre-unification Vale Law Library with the focused efficiency of a woman who has been solving other people's impossible problems for 7 years and has now been handed one of her own. Ronan worked differently, not at desks, but through networks. He sent writers to 3 other kingdoms within the week, to alpha courts that had records of dealings with the Grey Veil sorceress or entities like her. 2 wrote back within a fortnight. 1 had a surviving record of a renegotiated contract, different circumstances, the terms had been altered but not nullified, and the mechanism used was instructive. The other wrote back with something more valuable, a name. The entity who presented as the sorceress of the Grey Veil had a true name, not the name she used in contracts. Those were operational names, chosen to obscure. Her true name was older, stranger, and carried in the tradition of the Old Pact scholars as a specific category of entity, a Veeran, a collector of potential, bound by certain ancient rules of exchange that overrode any contract she made. Among those rules, a Veeran could not collect under terms that violated the custodial law of the territory in which the contract was executed. She was bound by the legal framework of the contract's jurisdiction. She wrote the contract in pre-unification Vale law, Elara said when Ronan brought her the letter, because that was the law in force when she first built this template. And pre-unification Vale law gives a living primary guardian the right to contest custodial transfer, Ronan said, which means she cannot collect as long as I am present and contesting. It means more than that. He was looking at the letter with the expression of a man examining something carefully before trusting its weight. It means the contract has a structural flaw she may not be aware of, or that she is aware of and has never had challenged because no one has ever read it closely enough to find it. Elara looked up at him. We challenge it. When she comes, we challenge the jurisdiction and the custodial clause simultaneously. We force her to litigate the terms rather than collect on them. Can you litigate with a Veeran? Can anyone stop me from trying? He looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. I don't believe anyone can. The court sensed something was happening without knowing what. This was inevitable. The archive requisition, the incoming correspondence from other alpha courts, the hours Elara and Aldrich spent behind closed doors, the way Ronan had stopped being the carefully measured king of the past 7 years and had become something different, more present, more watchful. The court noticed all of it and arrived at conclusions that were in every case incorrect but revealing of how much they had revised their assumptions about their queen. The most common theory, Mira reported, was that Elara was negotiating a new territorial alliance. The second most common was that something was wrong with the pregnancy. The third, held by a minority including Lady Corvin, was that the king and queen were conducting a purge of some kind, and the archive work was the preparation for it. Lady Corvin is the closest, Elara told Mira, in spirit, if not in specifics. She'd be thrilled to know that, Mira said. Should I tell her? Absolutely not. Elara turned back to the page she was annotating. But note that she'll be useful. If we need the court to understand something complex quickly, Lady Corvin is the fastest route from the top table to every corner of the room. Mira made a note with the satisfied expression of a woman whose particular skills are being recognized. What do you want her to know when the time comes? That the queen handled it, Elara said, whatever it turns out to look like. That the queen handled it. Just. She was 5 months pregnant when the weather changed. It happened in a single day. The temperature, which had been the ordinary cold of deep winter, dropped to something beyond that. Not natural cold. The kind of cold that has intention behind it, that settles into a place with the specific quality of an arrival rather than a season. The horses in the stable were restless all morning. The dogs in the kennels would not be quieted. The birds that had been wintering in the fortress's south-facing garden were gone when the gardener arrived at dawn. Not flown, just gone, the way birds go when they know something that people don't yet. Elara was in the archive when Breck came to the door. He didn't need to say anything. She looked at his face. She's here, she said. At the gates, he said. An hour ago. She's been waiting, just standing in the road outside the main gate. Not asking entry, just standing. She's giving us time to prepare, Aldrich said from across the table. He was very still. It's a courtesy. In her terms. Generous of her, Elara said. She closed the book she had been reading and stood up. Her back ached. The pregnancy was showing properly now, the weight of it shifting her center of balance in ways she had been quietly adapting to for 2 months. She pressed her hand against her lower back and breathed. You don't have to be the one to meet her, Ronan said from the doorway. She hadn't heard him come in. Yes, I do, she said. The custodial challenge has to come from the primary guardian directly. It can't be proxied. She looked at him. I've read the law 8 different ways. It has to be me. His jaw was tight. Then I'll be beside you. You'll be behind me, she said. That matters, legally. I need to be the one who speaks first and speaks alone. If you speak before I establish the custodial objection, she can reframe the negotiation as being between herself and you, which puts us back on the original contract's terms. She had worked this out over 3 weeks of careful preparation, tested it against Aldrich's knowledge twice, and against the letter from the old pact scholar once more. The moment she sees us both, I speak first. About the law. About the clause. You don't say a word until I have the jurisdictional objection on the record. On what record? He said. There's no court here. There's Aldrich, she said. And Breck, and Mira, and every member of this household who witnesses what is said. A barren is bound by witnessed exchange. That's the old pact scholar's letter. She cannot claim terms were differently understood once they've been spoken in front of witnesses. She looked at him steadily. It matters. Every word and every order of words matters. I need you to trust me. He looked at her for a long time. I have trusted you, he said, since the day you walked into council and took apart 7 years of Eastern water law in 40 minutes. A pause. I trust you now. Then let's go meet her, Elara said. The sorceress of the Grey Veil was standing in the road outside the fortress gates exactly as Breck had described. Not demanding, not threatening, simply present, with the absolute patience of something that has been waiting centuries for individual moments and has long since stopped experiencing time the way mortals do. She looked like a woman of middle years, silver-haired, dressed in smoke-colored robes that moved in a wind Elara couldn't feel. Her face was not unkind. That was the thing Elara registered first, coming through the gate with the cold pressing against her skin and her hand not on her belly, deliberately not on her belly, because she would not give this entity a single physical cue about where her attention was. The sorceress had the face of a woman who does what she does without malice. She was a collector. She had always been a collector. She saw no cruelty in it. Your Majesty, she said, and her voice was the texture of old paper, dry and precise. Her eyes moved to Ronan, briefly, and back to Elara. The king is with you. He is, Elara said. I am Queen Elara Thorn, primary guardian of the first child of the bond between myself and Alpha King Ronan Thorn. I am here in that capacity. She kept her voice even, clear, carrying the way she had learned to carry her voice across a council chamber full of men trying to talk over her. In my capacity as primary guardian, I am invoking the custodial contest right under pre-unification veil law, Article 14, Section 3. The transfer of custodial rights cannot proceed against the express and witnessed objection of a living, present, competent primary guardian. Silence. The cold road. The gray sky. The fortress wall on one side and the open land on the other, winter stripped and bare, the trees reduced to their bones. The sorceress looked at her. Something moved in her face, not the expression of someone caught, not fear, not anger. Something more complex than any of those. Something that was, Elara thought, the specific quality of surprise in an entity that had expected no surprises. The Article 14 clause, the sorceress said slowly, has not been invoked in 140 years, Elara said. I know. A woman in the Fell territories invoked it against a similar agreement. The claim was sustained. She held the sorceress's gaze without blinking. I am invoking it again, in front of these witnesses, on record, by Val law, as of this moment. Another silence. Longer. Your Majesty, the sorceress said, and her voice had shifted, not threatening, but recalibrated. The voice of someone who has arrived with one set of terms and has found the terrain different from the map. The contract between myself and the Alpha King predates your marriage. The terms were written in pre-unification Vale law, Elara said, at a time when the legal framework of the Vale territories governed. You chose that language. You wrote those terms. The jurisdiction is therefore Vale law, pre-unification. She let the pause land. And pre-unification Vale law does not recognize the transfer of custodial rights over a living child in the presence of a contesting living guardian. She tilted her head. Did you believe no one would read the contract carefully enough to find this? The sorceress was quiet for a moment. In 400 years of this particular contract, she said softly, no one has. Then perhaps, Elara said, this is overdue. What happened in the silence after that was something Elara felt before she saw, a shift in the quality of the cold, a change in the way the air around the sorceress sat. Not the change of something defeated, the change of something recalculating. The custodial clause is contested, the sorceress said finally, and each word had the weight of something being spoken for the record, as she understood that framing. I acknowledge the invocation of Article 14. A pause. However, the contract's primary terms, the breach itself, and the debt owed for that breach, remain in force. The Alpha broke the seal before its natural dissolution. That cannot be contested under the same clause. I know, Elara said. The debt does not disappear because the custodial route is closed. I know that too. Elara kept her eyes level. I am not claiming the debt disappears. I am claiming the method of collection is inadmissible. She let the pause extend. Which means we need to negotiate a different method. The sorceress looked at her for a very long time. You came here, she said slowly, not to dismiss the debt, but to renegotiate the terms of collection. Yes. You came prepared. I have been prepared for 3 months. Something in the sorceress's expression shifted, subtle, difficult to read, the micro-change of someone encountering something that has not happened to them before and finding, against their inclination, that it is interesting. What are you offering? She said. Elara had prepared 3 proposals. They stood in the cold road and she laid them out with the precision of someone who had argued 7 years of the kingdom's hardest cases and knew that negotiation was not about winning, but about finding the place where both sides could live with the outcome. The first proposal was rejected immediately, a monetary equivalent for the potential the sorceress sought, which the entity dismissed as a misunderstanding of what she collected and why. The second was more complex, a binding of the child's potential into a transferable form, a willing gift at adulthood when the child could consent to it, rather than a forced collection now. The sorceress considered this for longer than she had considered the first. At adulthood, she said, when the child may choose. When the child is of age and can make an informed decision about their own potential, Elara said, you get what you came for, eventually, with consent, which, under the old Pact scholar's analysis, gives you cleaner acquisition than a forced collection anyway. Consented potential is more potent than taken potential. She watched this land. The sorceress was still, but it was the stillness of consideration, not refusal. And the third proposal, she said? The third proposal, Elara said, is what happens if you decline the second. The sorceress waited. Under pre-unification Vale law, a contested custodial claim must be adjudicated by an arbiter of the old pact before any collection can proceed. Elara kept her voice level. I am requesting that adjudication, formally, which means no collection can proceed by your own binding rules until an arbiter has ruled. She looked at the sorceress steadily. How long does it take to convene an old pact arbiter? A silence. Decades, the sorceress said very quietly. Yes. Elara held the look. So, we can negotiate the second proposal today, and both walk away with something workable. Or we go to adjudication, and you walk away with nothing for 30 years minimum. She lifted her chin. I'd prefer to negotiate, but I will go to adjudication without hesitation if you require it. The wind moved across the cold road. In the fortress behind them, she heard a door, heard the distant sound of the horses still uneasy in their stable, heard the winter settling itself into the stones of Thornkeep with the patience of something very old. The sorceress looked at Elara Vale Thorn. She looked at her the way, Elara thought, someone looks at a map when they realize the territory has been remapped without their knowledge. Assessment, recalibration, something that was not admiration exactly, but was the specific quality of recognition between two people who understand each other's tools. The second proposal, the sorceress said, the terms require precision. I brought a draft, Elara said, and turned to take the document from Aldrich, who had been standing 3 steps behind her with the expression of a man watching someone dismantle a problem he had lived with for 20 years, and feeling entirely conflicted about how straightforward it looked. She handed the document to the sorceress. The entity read it, slowly, with the focused attention of 4 centuries of contract literacy. Here, she said, pointing to a clause, the age of consent for the transfer must be specified. 25, Elara said. Old enough for judgment. 22, 24, 23. Agreed, Elara said, because this was how negotiation worked. You knew which numbers were real and which were positioning, and this one had been positioning from the start. 2 more adjustments. A clause about the method of transfer. The sorceress's preference, which Elara accepted because it cost nothing material and gave the entity the sense of form she clearly valued. A clause about documentation, which Elara tightened because vague documentation was where agreements fell apart later. Then the sorceress looked up from the document. Your child, she said, and something in her voice had changed. Something stripped of the contractual and returned to something older and more direct, will be extraordinary, not because of the bond's potential, though that is significant, because of the mother. She looked at Elara without any of the calculation of the previous hour, just looking, with the flat, clear attention of something very old that is not often surprised. I have made this contract in 17 kingdoms over 4 centuries. No one has done what you just did. Elara met her eyes. Then perhaps the contract needed updating, she said. The sorceress almost smiled. It was a strange thing to witness, in a face that had worn the same expression for longer than living memory. She signed the document. Aldrich witnessed it. Breck witnessed it. Mira, standing at Elara's right shoulder with a composure that was costing her visibly, witnessed it. The sorceress of the Grey Veil folded her copy with the care of someone handling something that matters. And she turned, and she walked back down the cold road the way she had come, and the unnatural cold went with her. Not gradually, not by degrees, but all at once, like a door closing. The ordinary winter came back in. Elara stood in the road and let out a breath that had been held, in some form, for 3 months. Beside her, Ronan put his hand on her shoulder, not gently, not carefully, but with the full weight of a man who has been standing 6 feet away from something terrible and not moving because she asked him not to, and is now reacquainting himself with the right to touch her. You did it, Mira said, from 3 feet away, in the voice of a woman who is not going to cry again and will succeed at this by sheer determination. We did it, Elara said. This part. What does that mean? This part, Mira asked. Elara looked at the document in her hand, the agreement that had taken 3 months to build and 6 minutes to execute. The draft she had written 4 times before she was satisfied with it. The argument she had assembled clause by clause from old law books and older letters, and 7 years of learning how to fight for outcomes in rooms where no one thought she had standing. She thought about her child. 23 years from now, the sorceress would return, and her child would make their own decision about their own potential. She had not removed the debt. She had not been able to. But she had moved it. From a collection to a conversation, from a taking to a choice, from a thing done to her child to a thing her child would one day be able to face with knowledge and agency and, if she did her job, with the same stubborn, thorough preparation that had built this moment. It was not a complete victory. It was a beginning. But then, she had been valuing beginnings for a long time. She turned to Aldrich, who was standing in the road with the expression of a man at the end of 20 years of carrying something and finding his arms suddenly empty. Tell the council, she said. Tell them the queen handled it. The old man looked at her. Yes, your majesty, he said quietly. I believe they will not be surprised. Behind her, Thornkeep's gate stood open in the winter light, and Ronan's hand was warm on her shoulder, and 3 months of cold dread were lifting out of the morning the way the unnatural cold had lifted. All at once, entirely, leaving behind only the ordinary weight of a life that was still complicated but was, finally, entirely hers. She walked back through the gates of her own fortress with her head up and the signed agreement in her hand, and inside the walls the household was waiting, and the life she had been building through 7 years of silence was still there, intact, ungiven, entirely her own. She had kept it. That, she decided, was enough for today. But today had a way of becoming tomorrow, and tomorrow had a way of carrying its own weight, and the weeks after the sorceress left proved that the business of living is never as clean as the moment of its turning point. The news traveled through the fortress by the end of that first day. Not the full story. Elara was careful about that, careful about what was said and how and in what order. But enough. The court understood that something had come to the gates of Thornkeep and been turned away, that the queen had gone out to meet it, that she had come back with a signed document in steady hands and the particular expression of someone who has just done something difficult and is already thinking about what comes next. Lady Corvin found her in the corridor outside the great hall before dinner, and this time there was no purring tone, no calculated warmth, just a straight look, from one woman to another, and a small nod that said everything her words didn't. "The court has been talking," Lady Corvin said. "The court always talks," Elara said. "Yes, but today they are talking about you differently." A pause. "They have been wrong about you. Most of them know it now." Elara looked at her. "And you?" "I have been wrong about several things," Lady Corvin said without flinching. "I have been wrong about the specific things I assumed your limitations to be. I confused silence with weakness. I think many of us did." "It's a common mistake," Elara said. "It is," the older woman agreed. "It will not be made again. Not here." She moved on. Elara watched her go, thinking about the 7 years of whispers and the particular shape of a reputation rebuilt. Not from the top down, the way power usually worked, but from the ground up, from the accumulated weight of competence and patience and the refusal to be diminished by people who didn't know what they were looking at. She had not set out to prove anything to the court. She had set out to protect her child. The court's recalibration was a consequence, not an objective, but it was not nothing. She allowed herself that much. The child arrived on the last day of winter. Not early, not dramatically, at the ordinary time, in the ordinary progression, with the particular brisk efficiency that had characterized Elara's management of everything else in her life. The court physician, who had spent 7 months revising his assumptions about his queen, delivered the news to the assembled household with an expression of genuine emotion that he clearly found professionally inconvenient. "A son," he said. "Both mother and child are well." The sound that came from the assembled household was not polite applause. It was something deeper than that, the specific release of breath that a group of people lets out when something they have been hoping for and fearing for and carrying the uncertainty of for a very long time resolves into solid reality. Even Fenwick, Lord of the North, and reliable opposition to approximately half of Elara's governance decisions, stood with his cup raised and his face wearing an expression she had never seen on it before. Something that was, she was told later by Mira, straightforwardly glad. She was told all of this afterward because she was not in the great hall. She was in her room, which had stopped being only her room sometime in the autumn and was now a room that contained, very specifically, her husband's presence in the corner chair and the smell of the cedar medicine box on the side table, and an infant who had arrived in the world with dark hair and a serious expression, and Ronan's hands, long-fingered and deliberate, that she knew immediately and completely, the way you know things that are both new and entirely familiar at once. She held him. That was what she did. She held him and looked at him and said nothing for a long time. "He looks like you," she said finally. Ronan, in the corner chair, leaned forward. He had been very still since the birth, the particular stillness she had learned to read as emotion being carefully contained, which in him was always the sign of the largest feelings. He was looking at the child with the expression of a man whose architecture has been fundamentally altered and who is in the process of discovering that the alteration is not a loss, but an expansion. He has your mouth, Ronan said. He has your hands. He has... Ronan stopped. He reached out slowly, and the infant's hand, impossibly small, curled tight as a new leaf, opened instinctively at the contact. Ronan's finger was taken in that grip. The grip held. Something happened in his face. She had seen him move before. She had seen the walls come down and the control fail, and the raw thing underneath surface in different forms. Anger, want, fear, the particular grief of a man who built his isolation too well to dismantle it quickly. She had seen all of it over 7 years and the 8 months since. She had not seen this. This was not any of those things. This was beyond them. This was the expression of a man encountering something that required an entirely new category of feeling, something that had no precedent in 17 years of careful management and was therefore completely unmanageable, and he was not even trying to manage it. He was just present in it, fully, without defense. "What are we going to name him?" she asked. Ronan looked at her. The question seemed to take him a moment to process, as if his mind was working at some distance from ordinary conversation. "You choose," he said. "I'd like you to choose." "We choose together," she said. He looked at the child, at the hand still wrapped around his finger with the blind, complete trust of something that has arrived in the world and immediately organized itself around the nearest warmth. "Aldrin," he said. "My grandfather's name, before all of this, before the seal, before the bargain. He was the last king in my line who ruled without the force becoming a crisis." A pause. "He was a good man." "Aldrin Thorne," Elara said, testing it. "If you—" "I like it," she said. Aldrin. The name settled into the room the way certain things settle, not announced but established, as if it had been waiting to be spoken and had now found its place. Spring came early that year. The fortress grounds, which spent the winter as bare stone and frozen earth, began to soften in the second week after Aldrin's birth, tentative green showing in the south-facing corners of the garden, the first stubborn flowers pushing up along the inner wall. The court took this as a sign, because courts always take everything as a sign, and the sign they took it as was that the kingdom had turned a corner. Elara, nursing her son in the chair by the window and watching the garden show its first color, thought, maybe it had. The governance didn't stop. She had half expected, or half dreaded, from the court's expectation that she would retreat from her role, that the pregnancy and birth would be used as a mechanism to gently edge her back to the ornamental position she had occupied in the first years. She watched for it. It didn't come. What came instead was subtler and more interesting. Lord Aldrich began CCing her on correspondence that previously went to the king first. Lord Fenwick, reluctantly and with the face of a man conceding a point he had bet against, began addressing her questions directly rather than looking to Ronan for confirmation. The Eastern representatives, when they came for the spring negotiations, brought their amended proposals to her first. "They're afraid of you," Ronan observed one evening, watching from the doorway as she finished annotating the spring brief with Aldrin asleep in the cradle 6 feet away. "They're not afraid," she said. "They've recalibrated." "What's the difference?" "Fear makes people avoid you. Recalibration makes them come to you." She set down her pen. "I'd rather be the one they come to." He came to the desk and stood beside her, looking at the brief. "The Eastern Lords are going to push back on the grain storage clause." "I know, I built in room." She pointed to the relevant section. "This number looks like the limit, but it's not. I can move here and still land where I need to be." She looked up at him. "You've been watching me negotiate for 7 years. Did you think I didn't know what I was doing?" "I knew exactly what you were doing," he said. "I was watching to see if you knew." She stared at him. "That is either an enormous compliment or deeply patronizing, and I can't decide which." "Both," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. "Probably both." She pushed him, lightly, with the comfortable ease of people who have learned each other's weight. He caught her hand and kept it, and Aldrin made a small sound in the cradle, and the spring evening settled around the three of them in the particular warm ordinariness of a life that had been a long time coming. 2 months after Aldrin's birth, Ronan stopped taking the medicine. He told her first. He came to her sitting room on an afternoon when she was alone, and he sat across from her and he said, "I want to stop the compound." She put down her book. "Why?" "Because I want to know what the force is without the seal and without the suppressant," he said. "What it actually is. Not managed, not contained, just present and grounded." He met her eyes. "The bond is stable. You know that. You can feel it. The scholars say—" "I've read what the scholars say," she said. "A fully stabilized true mate bond grounds an alpha's power the way the suppressant does, but naturally, without the side effects." She studied him. "You want to understand what you actually are." "I've spent 17 years afraid of it," he said, "managing it at arm's length. I'd like to meet it, I suppose, with you beside me." She was quiet for a moment. "What does Aldrich say?" "He says the timing is reasonable. The bond is 8 months old. The force has been stable for 6. A pause. "He says it should have been done years ago, but that everything should have been done years ago, and he has made a personal policy of not revisiting that particular catalog of errors." She almost smiled. "Very wise of him." She looked at Ronan, at this man she had been learning for 8 months and had been beside for 7 years before that, and who she was still, she understood, only partially mapped. There were rooms in him she hadn't been in yet. Dark ones, probably. The kind that get built when you spend 17 years managing something alone that should have had help. "All right," she said. "We stop the medicine." She held his gaze. "But we do it together. Whatever comes up, whatever the force is without the suppressant, you don't manage it alone. You tell me. We face it in the same room." "I'm not certain what comes up will be manageable," he said honestly. "I'm not asking for a guarantee," she said. "I'm asking you not to disappear behind a locked door again." He was quiet for a moment. "I won't," he said. "I promise you." She believed him. She believed him because he had been keeping promises to her in the small ways that matter, had been present when he said he would be present, had come to her when things were difficult, had not once in 8 months chosen the locked door over the open one. One promise built on another. That was how trust actually worked. She had learned this the hard way, over 7 years of having nothing else to learn from. The first week without the medicine was uneventful. The second week, he was restless in the way she recognized, the particular tension that built in him when the force was active, the heightened awareness that turned rooms into tactical environments and distances into calculations. She watched it without comment, staying close, letting the bond do its work. He slept badly for 3 nights, and then better. The restlessness ebbed. On the 10th day, something shifted. She felt it before he described it. The bond between them had a communicative quality she was still learning the full range of, but certain things came through clearly, strong signals against the ordinary background. She felt it that morning like a change in the air before weather, something large and old moving, reorganizing itself. Ronan found her in the garden with Aldrin, and he sat down on the stone bench beside her, and he was quiet for a long time. "It's not what I thought it was," he said finally. She waited. "I thought it felt like danger," he said. "For 17 years it felt like something that wanted to destroy things. When it built up, when I couldn't contain it, it felt violent, hungry, out of control." He looked at his hands. "Without the suppressant, with the bond stable, but it doesn't feel like that." He paused. "It feels like weight, like responsibility, like something that wants to protect, not damage. The seal suppressed everything, including—" He stopped. "I think the suppressant may have been making it worse, containing it without discharging it, like damming a river and wondering why there's pressure." "The destruction at 19, Elara said carefully. "At the transition. Was a young man with an enormous force, and no outlet for it," he said. "No bond, no stability, 17 years of my father's death, and the force building without a safe channel, and then the transition hitting all of it at once." He looked at her. "I was never the danger. The isolation was the danger." She sat with this. 17 years, she said. "Yes." "You spent 17 years afraid of the wrong thing." "Yes." His voice was even, but she could feel what was underneath it through the bond. Something heavy and old, the specific grief of time that can be named but not recovered. She put her hand over his. "Then stop being afraid of it," she said. "It's yours. It has always been yours. Learn what it actually is." He turned his hand under hers, palm up, and she felt the bond pulse between them, warm and present and entirely itself, nothing suppressed or contained about it, just the actual thing in its actual form. "I'm learning," he said. Spring became summer, and summer brought its own rhythms to Thornkeep. Aldrin grew with the particular speed of infants, impossible to track day by day, obvious by the week, astonishing by the month. He had Ronan's coloring and Elara's attention span, which was to say considerable, and he watched the world from very early on with the focused interest of a person who has arrived somewhere interesting and intends to understand it fully. Ronan with the baby was one of the things Elara filed under unexpected and revisited frequently because it gave her genuine pleasure. He was not demonstrative in the way that some people are with infants, did not make performance of it, did not do the things people do to signal that they are good at being affectionate. He simply held his son with the specific care of someone who has identified a thing of enormous value and is treating it accordingly. He talked to Aldrin in the low, even voice he used for important council business, as if the child's current inability to respond was a temporary condition that didn't affect the seriousness of the conversation. She came into the study one evening and found Ronan at his desk with Aldrin held against his shoulder, a state document open in front of him, talking the child through the northern border renegotiation in complete detail. "He's 4 months old," she said. "He's listening," Ronan said without looking up. "He's asleep." A pause. He was listening. She sat down across from them and watched her husband explain the territorial implications of the northern grazing rights to their sleeping infant. And she thought about the 19-year-old boy who had nearly destroyed 3 villages and spent 17 years building walls against his own nature because no one had taught him that the force inside him was not an enemy but a responsibility. She thought about the locked doors and the measured distance and the 7 years of barren spoken on the other side of tapestries. She thought, look at us now. The council meeting that autumn was the one she would remember as the moment the recalibration became official. It had been called to address the question of the eastern expansion, new territory available through a treaty arrangement, the kind of acquisition that required careful thought about what the kingdom could absorb and govern well, and what it was reaching for beyond its capacity. It was the largest political question the council had faced in a decade, and Elara had been preparing her position for 6 weeks. Fenwick arrived with his own proposal, as expected. He had done good work on it. She acknowledged that, genuinely. He had clearly spent comparable time, and his numbers were solid and his argument was well structured. She listened to the full thing without interrupting, which she knew he appreciated, because she had learned that Fenwick's combativeness was not malice but the habit of a man who had spent 40 years in rooms where listening was treated as concession. Then she presented hers. It was different from his. Not opposed, not a refutation, but a different framework entirely. One that addressed the acquisition not as territorial gain, but as an administrative integration challenge, and that built in a structure for the new territory's governance that drew on what she had developed in the eastern boroughs but was modified for different conditions. She had consulted the eastern representatives, had ridden out twice to the proposed territory, had talked to its existing population through intermediaries about what they needed from a governing authority. She knew what she was asking for. She knew why. She could answer every question before it was asked. Fenwick let her finish. Then he looked at his own proposal, looked at hers. "The Queen's framework addresses the administrative gap I didn't build for," he said, and said it directly and without the hedging she had come to expect from him when acknowledging her contributions. "The integration structure is better than mine." A silence in the council room. "I'd suggest combining them," Elara said. "Your acquisition timeline and resource calculation are better than mine. My governance framework and community consultation component are better than yours." She looked at him steadily. "Neither proposal alone is complete. Together they are." Fenwick looked at her for a long moment. "Agreed," he said. It was the first time in 7 years that Fenwick had agreed with her before being cornered into it. Aldrich, at the far end of the table, made a small notation in his margin. She saw it. She didn't ask what it said. She could guess. On the first anniversary of Aldrin's birth, Ronan gave her something unexpected. They were in her sitting room. Their sitting room by now, the boundary between their spaces having dissolved so gradually over the past year that she couldn't have named when exactly it happened. And Aldrin was asleep in the next room, and the evening was quiet in the specific way that evenings get when a household with an infant finally finds its moment of collective stillness. He set a small box on the table beside her. Not cedar this time. Older wood, dark and smooth with handling. She looked at him. "Open it," he said. Inside was a document. Older than the agreement she had made with the sorceress. Old enough that the edges had browned and the writing was the formal script of a previous reign. She read it and then read it again. It was a charter. The original charter of the Vale territories, her father's lands, her birthplace. The territory that had been ceded to Thornkeep as part of the marriage treaty and had technically ceased to exist as an independent governance unit when she wed Ronan. It had been restored. Not as a separate territory. She read the language carefully. She always read the language carefully. But as a co-governed region with its own council structure, operating within the Thornkeep framework but maintaining its distinct administrative identity. It bore Ronan's seal and Aldrich's witness, and a third seal she recognized as belonging to the original Vale Treaty Council. "This has been in progress for how long?" she asked. "Since spring," he said. "It required negotiating the original treaty terms, which were not cleanly worded, and several conversations with the Vale Council representatives, and Aldrich spent approximately 3 months being insufferably technical about jurisdictional language." A pause. "He enjoyed it." "Ronan." She looked up. "The Vale was my father's." "Yes." "You restored it." "I restored your right to govern it," he said. "There's a difference." He looked at her steadily. "It was taken from you as the cost of peace between our territories. That cost was it was not necessary. The peace could have been built another way. I know that now." He paused. "I cannot give you back the years or the manner of how we began. But this is mine," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. "It has always been yours," he said. "I was slow to recognize it." She looked at the charter and thought about her father's lands, the particular color of the light there in autumn, the smell of the Vale's eastern orchards in early summer, the specific low hills that her horse had known by heart before she was 12. She thought about the girl she had been when she walked away from it, 22 years old with white hawthorn in her hands and a crown she hadn't chosen and a future she couldn't read. She thought about everything the girl hadn't known she was walking toward. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He was looking at her with the expression she had no name for still. The one that had appeared the first time he held Aldrin, that occupied a category no previous expression of his had prepared her to receive. She was still learning it. She suspected she would spend a long time learning it. "There is one more thing," he said. She looked up. "I have spoken to the old Pact scholars about the agreement with the sorceress," he said. "The clause regarding Aldrin at 23. He was careful, measured, the way he was when saying something he needed to say exactly right. The scholars have a framework, a preparation, things that can be taught to a child born of a true mate bond, ways of understanding their own potential, of having knowledge and agency around what they carry." He paused. "If Aldrin goes to that conversation at 23 with full knowledge of what he is and what is being offered and what his choices are, he won't be afraid of the wrong thing," Elara said. "No." She thought about a 19-year-old boy and a force he had never been taught to understand. She thought about 17 years of walls. "We teach him everything," she said, "from the beginning. What he is, what he carries, what the world will ask of him, and what he has the right to refuse." She met Ronan's eyes. "We don't build the walls, we build the understanding instead." "Yes," Ronan said simply, "and when the sorceress comes, if she comes, he will face her the way I faced her, with preparation and knowledge and the stubbornness to read the fine print." The corner of Ronan's mouth moved. "He will have advantages we didn't," he said. "He'll know what's coming. He'll have had 23 years to prepare." A pause. And he'll have us. She looked at the charter in her hands. She looked at the man across from her. This man who had been, in sequence and sometimes simultaneously, a stranger and a king and a locked door and a terrifying eruption and a carefully held hand and a voice saying please in the dark and a forehead pressed against hers on a cold stone floor. Who was now the person who sat across from her in the evenings and read her the parts of letters she had missed and argued with her about Eastern governance with the specific engagement of someone who has decided that being disagreed with by a person of strong convictions is not a threat, but a feature? She thought about the court that had called her barren for 7 years and was now watching her govern with something that had slowly, visibly, moved from tolerance to respect to something she was only recently willing to call by its real name. She thought about Mira, who had told her 6 years ago that she was the strongest person in this fortress and had been quietly, consistently, unspectacularly right. She thought about the girl with white hawthorn in her hands at the altar. That girl had not known that the silent man across from her was not cold but terrified, had not known that the locked doors were not rejection but the specific desperate management of something that could have destroyed her, had not known that 7 years of distance was going to become this room, this fire, this man, this charter in her hands, this child asleep in the next room whose name would mean something in the history of this kingdom beyond what she could yet see. She had not known any of it. She had walked forward anyway. That, she thought, was the thing, not the intelligence or the preparation or the skill with old law and difficult negotiations. Those were instruments. The thing underneath them, the thing that had kept her walking forward through 7 years of silence and a court's contempt, and a marriage that looked from the outside like a failure and felt from the inside like a long, patient wait, was simpler than any of those. She had refused to stop. She had refused to become the version of herself the court expected, diminished, decorative, defined by what she lacked. She had kept working, kept ruling, kept learning the landscape of a man who had never been taught to let anyone in, and had eventually, inevitably, let her in anyway, because she was always there, and always herself. And the fortress walls can keep most things out, but they cannot keep out the person who has already decided to stay. I want to take Aldrin to the Vale in the spring, she said, when he's old enough for the journey. I want him to see it. We'll go, Ronan said. No calculation, no logistics, no qualification. Just, we'll go. She looked at him. You've been there once, she said, when the treaty was signed. Yes. What did you think of it? He considered. The light is different from here. In the late afternoon, the hills catch it differently than the fortress walls. It stays longer. He paused. I thought it was the most beautiful place I had ever seen, and I understood immediately why someone would trade it for peace between two territories. He met her eyes. I also thought it was the wrong trade. It was the wrong trade, she said. Yes. But it gave us this. Yes, he said, and his voice had all the weight of 7 years and everything that came after in its single syllable. She set the charter down on the table. She reached across and took his hand, not formally, not with the care of people still learning whether they have the right, but easily, the way you take the hand of someone who is yours and who you are, the gesture that is so practiced and certain it has stopped being a gesture and started being just the ordinary vocabulary of a life. He folded his hand around hers. In the next room, Aldrin slept through his first birthday with the same focused attention he brought to everything, dark hair and serious expression, and his father's hands and his mother's refusal to be anything other than entirely himself. The fortress settled around them, old stone and new fire, and the particular deep quiet of a place that has been, over a long time and at considerable cost, made into something it hadn't been before. Not perfect. Not without its complications or its old debts or the 23 years of future that still held its own questions, its own reckonings, its own version of a young person facing a sorceress in a cold road and being asked what they were made of. But here, real, entirely theirs. Outside the window, the last of winter was gone, and the Vale's autumn light, particular and golden, the kind that stays, lay across the stones of Thornkeep like a hand, warm and unhurried, that had been reaching for this place for a very long time and had finally arrived. Elara Vale. Thorn, Queen of Thornkeep and co-governor of the restored Vale territories, mother of Aldrin Thorn, and wife of a man she had spent 7 years learning and would spend the rest of her life continuing to learn, looked at the fire and felt the bond warm in her chest and held her husband's hand in the quiet room. She had walked forward. She had kept walking. She was still here. That was the whole of it, and it was enough, more than enough, and exactly right. And she had earned every inch of it in the long way that things worth having are earned. Not in a single moment of courage or cleverness, but in the accumulated weight of 10,000 smaller choices, made day after day in the particular darkness of a life that looked from the outside like it was failing and was in fact becoming, with the slow and stubborn patience of someone who had decided not to be less than herself, exactly what it was always meant to be: the end.